All right, what's up, everyone? We're back for another online polymath salon. We have a very, very fun set of guests today. We have from the Machine Perception Cognitive Robotics Lab, Center for Complex Systems, we have Professors Alain Barinholtz and William Hahn. And then we're also joined by Eliade and Andres himself from the Qualia Research Institute. And we're going to be talking about all sorts of crazy stuff: Qualia, consciousness, phenomenology, perception, info hazards. Who knows where the discussion will go. The nice thing about ekkolápto stuff is it's improvisational and it can go anywhere. And you can get in some really cool territories that you probably may not have explored before. That's the vibe that we're going for today. And before we get rolling into everything, let's have a quick intro from all of our guests. Alain, you want to go first?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Alain Barinholtz. I, together with William Hahn, direct the Machine Perception Cognitive Robotics Lab over at FAU. Working on a whole bunch of LLM-related research in autoregressive theory of cognition. Maybe we'll get into that at some point.
Hi there. I'm a perfumer with the Qualia Research Institute. I am doing studies on phenomenal objects and the geometry of all sorts of odor. What is this reception actually doing to our phenomenal field?
Nice. And then Dr. William Hahn.
And nice to see everybody. I've been thinking about machines and computers and people most of my life, and spending the last 10 years with Elon, picking each other's brains about what that stuff, what that really looks like.
For clarification, Alain Barinholtz, not Elon Musk. Two different
people. The one on the call, and Olfaction is actually one of the things that we first started kicking around. And so that's something definitely close to our heart that is going to be ripe for machine learning and has a lot of practical applications. And then lately, I've just been trying to think of these things, as Addy likes to mention, as sort of digital psychedelics. How can we use this new understanding of the world to change our mind and change how we perceive the world we're in?
And then finally, Andres himself, founder of QRI. Quick intro.
Hello, co-founder of the Qualia Research Institute, and I've been blogging about consciousness since 2014, and just like broadly interested in philosophy of mind, philosophy of physics, transhumanism, ethics, but above all, like phenomenology. I think like that's the thing I'm the most like to dive into. And go ahead.
I know you've spoken a little bit about your background and your kind of motivations and inspirations to get into this stuff a little bit on our pal Kurt Mungel's channel as well, and other podcasts. But if you don't mind giving this new audience kind of a quick idea about like your background and like what was the catalyst that got you into this stuff?
Always interested about the nature of reality. Just very curious kid in general. I used to think like mathematics was like the one and only way to figure out the nature of reality. And then, around like the age of 16, had a unusual reaction to marijuana where I had like an ego death experience. It hasn't happened since or before. It was a one time for that drug in particular, but that essentially made me reconsider kind of like priorities when it came to making sense of, okay, like what is it that we actually understand about reality? And I kind of like reprioritized consciousness as like the bigger problem. I mean, trying to make sense of reality from the point of view of consciousness rather than consciousness from the point of view of physics. I mean, at the end of the day, a little bit of a Ouroboros, but that shifted my priorities. And so I studied symbolic systems, what's essentially cognitive science. And also then I have a master's in psychology. And then I worked as a data science engineer for several years, actually quite a bit on like language models back when they didn't work, when they weren't actually all that useful. And then, since 2018, I've been full-time doing consciousness research in a number of fronts, a lot of different topics to cover. But what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit kind of at the speculative edge, but I'm curious to see what people think about it.
Perfect. So with that said, let's roll into your presentation then.
All right, everybody. So this is a brief speculative kind of the slides are more to anchor me than anything else. But just kind of to walk you through a little bit what I'm thinking about with regards to the screen of consciousness. So I'll just like first walk you through a couple kind of like diagrams that our friend and lineage, Stephen Lehar, kind of like has made. So like Stephen Lehar is a cognitive scientist, most famous for his theory of perception he calls harmonic gestalt. But importantly, he's very much a strong advocate of what can be described as indirect realism about perception. Also, they call it like inferential realism. He has this book called The Grand Illusion, where he kind of like outlines how he came to that realization. It is actually one of those things that I think it's a fairly common realization, but also surprisingly not universal. So like a lot of people may go their entire lives without ever realizing what I'm about to share. And for other people, it's intuitive, since they're like 5 years old, they realize, okay, like this is pretty obvious. But yeah, like one of the key, kind of insights here is that you never perceive the world directly, right? Like everything that you experience is one way of thinking about it is like it's an intuition or it's a model that your brain, your nervous system, your body is making of the environment. And you don't have kind of like a direct access to the environment as far as we can tell. And of course, yeah, there's like strong examples of these, like, okay, like hallucinations and dreaming. But for the most part, intuitively, you ask a random person like, hey, like, why is it the case that, when you open your eyes, you see the table in front of you, they might say something like, well, it's because it's there, it's emitting photons. You're just like perceiving it. But hey, actually, the thing that you're perceiving is your internal world simulation of that environment. And, the photons are there kind of like part of the causal chain that gives rise to the world simulation, but it's important to distinguish the two. And, intuitively, one key kind of aspect of the simulation that we're in, our experience, is it has a certain kind of geometry. The visual field, at the very least, is kind of this like two-dimensional screen with depth, which you can kind of capture conceptually with, hey, this is the feed of a camera. And okay, like intuitively, hey, we have two cameras, right? Like one in each eye. And somehow that information is being put together into kind of like this phenomenal visual field. But, it's a bit more than just kind of the visual field, right? Like in fact, your world simulation, the way Stephen Lehar described it, is as a diorama, right? Like it actually has kind of this like property of like variable scale that as you kind of like move further away from kind of like your eyes, if you take a cube, for example, and you get it to be very close to you, the lines will actually not look parallel, right? Like it's only cubes that are like very far away from you where the lines actually start to become parallel, which means that your world simulation has what Stephen Lehar would describe as variable scale. And in fact, like that variability in the scale is what allows us to distinguish between objects that look the same but are at different distances from us, right? So like a cube, even though it's the same shape, when it's really close together, right, like the lines become very acute, at least like very in front of your eyes. It's only when things are very far that you can, kind of this like what's called an isometric projection comes into play, which is, hey, like parallel lines like stay parallel. And there's kind of like this important argument. This is, I guess, like at least from the point of view of philosophy of mind, which is kind of like, is there a sense in which, hey, like we're actually perceiving a screen in our experience? Like, is it the case that the way the simulation works, right, is kind of you're creating a mini environment inside you, and then you have like a little entity inside that is kind of experiencing it? And, rightfully, people complain about this sort of like framework by saying like, well, if you actually have like a little guy inside of you who's perceiving the screen in front of you, then you have the question of like, okay, like, but how does that little guy inside put the information together in order to experience the screen? In other words, just saying like, hey, there's this kind of like theater inside you, and there's like a little homunculus, a little guy inside, that doesn't really advance any explanation, right? You're just kind of like delaying it further, because you still have to ask, okay, like how is that information being put together further again? And yeah, Daniel Dennett at least famously kind of described this as a infinite recursion kind of problem. That like, okay, like where is the little guy inside the little guy, and then the little guy inside that little guy, and so on. But interestingly, like Stephen Lehar what he would say is that, well, actually, yes, there is a little guy. There is a little guy in your world simulation, but you only simulate one level of it. And in fact, the little guy inside your world simulation is not really the perceiver. It's actually just another content of the world simulation. If you think about it, right, like you have kind of this like embodied sense of who you are. You have, you're looking yourself in the mirror. You can identify yourself with the image in the mirror, but you don't need to kind of like verify anything further inside of yourself, right? Like introspectively, and this can be kind of creepy the first time you realize it. In some sense, like inside of our head, there's empty space, right? Like in our world simulation, it's almost like there's nothing inside our head, meaning that, yeah, it's not the thing that is inside of our simulated head that is like the perceiver. It's more that, okay, there's like some kind of witness that is experiencing the entire diorama, including the felt sense of an internal perceiver within that diorama, right? In that sense, the perceiver or the subject is part of the simulation, and therefore likely also kind of like a fixable parameter, something that you can play with and mess with. But I want to get back to this kind of like concept of the metaphor of like kind of like a camera, and specifically like why this doesn't really work. Like, why is it the case that, okay, like our sensory organ is a camera and therefore that's why we experience a screen? You have to kind of like go very deep into kind of like how information can come together in a universe like ours. And I really should have like more dedicated diagrams. I mean, this maybe goes a little bit deeper into this, but the main idea that I want to convey is that at least if you look carefully at what a camera does, that's clearly not sufficient to explain kind of like the geometric quality of our experience. Like there's something stranger going on. Why? Right? Because, okay, like how do you integrate pieces of information into kind of like a unified moment of experience if, okay, like our sensory apparatus works like a camera? Well, you can ask, okay, like where is actually the information coming together? And as far as I can tell, there's like arguably two kind of like strong candidates that you can say where the information is coming together to kind of like become this unified experience. The first is essentially kind of like the convergence or the aperture, like the focal point where like all the lines kind of like converge. But there is two problems with this kind of view. The first one is, well, points, at least like mathematical points, don't have enough information to actually capture, the rich information content of your experience, right? Like if the light was actually converging into a single point, by virtue of being a point, it doesn't have enough structure. It doesn't have enough richness to be able to capture our experience, right? Like our experience is more than just a zero-dimensional point. So instead, you've got to look at, okay, like maybe it's the aperture as a whole. And, in physics, there is this thing called like the diffraction limit, which is if you want to capture, patterns of a certain size, like particular spatial frequencies, the aperture needs a minimum of a certain, physical length or physical width to be able to capture those patterns. If you make it too small, there's wavelengths that just don't go through, right? So there's kind of like a minimum size of the aperture in order to be able to actually capture information at the level of optics. So, hey, we're looking at something that is like spatially distributed. But then if the screen of consciousness, as it were, was, okay, like the information in the aperture, you do have kind of this question of like, okay, like, but what is like special about the aperture that would work as kind of like a physical limit that actually, creates a objective boundary, so to speak, that distinguishes my experience from your experience? And it's kind of like difficult to imagine, like what kind of like principled mechanism would make just an aperture actually be, the binding or the glue, as it were. And then, the other very strong option is the, in this case, like the film or like the place where you're kind of like recording the image. In the case of a digital camera, there's going to be a lot of pixel-like sensors. But the problem there is that, hey, like the image is also now being like spread out over like an actual, physical region of space. And then you have the question of, hey, how is that information being put together into a unified moment of experience? And you again have kind of these like issues of arbitrariness. So that, well, you could say like only this region of the screen versus this other vision of the screen? Why should we consider the entire screen as that which you're experiencing all at once? All of this is to kind of like hint at or try to evoke kind of this like sense of, this puzzling sense of like, hey, hold on a second, where is the screen actually being projected? Where is that being put together? Because you have kind of this question of like, well, even if you were to actually be putting it in a kind of like spatially continuous place, from what point of view is that being witnessed, right? From one point of view is that being experienced? And all of this is to kind of like, showcase that, okay, like a very conventional or standard explanation for the screen of experience doesn't really work. We need something more sophisticated, more conceptually fleshed out. I'll just kind of like walk you through some of the considerations, some of the ideas that I have in this space. So the first one is to notice, this also is from Stephen Lehar, in particular his publication called Cartoon Epistemology, which you can Google and get the entire comic strip. This is to show that like, hey, like our world simulation, the quality of our world simulation is actually blending information from several sensory fields at once. And in particular, there's kind of like three that are kind of like meshed together to create the internal representation of our environment. So first we have just kind of like what Stephen Lehar would call the like modal visual information, which is like, the colors, the textures of our environment. Here described as kind of these like, eye looking at various colors, colored shapes like, a house and a street. But then you also have like proprioception, right? Like you have like this intuitive feeling of where your body is and how is your body positioned. And that, conditions and informs, the meaning of the simulation, right? Like if you're looking at something, but you have like the sense of, hey, like my neck is twisted to the left, that affects how you're going to process that visual stream, right? Like it's contextualized by, hey, this is a scene, but looked from the side in a sense, right? Like the musculature, how you're actually putting your head, all of that conditions, the rendering of the scene. And then finally, you also have these, what Lehar might describe as kind of like a force field-like somatic representation. So one of the kind of like big claims that he makes, and this is phenomenological, first and foremost, is that we encode kind of like a force field that tells our body where to move and how to move. So in some almost kind of like literal sense, when you see something really attractive, let's say like a chocolate cake, that like, okay, like you're dieting and you really want to eat that chocolate cake, in some sense, kind of like that gets encoded as a kind of force field around it, such that if you were,
it's like an attractor thing. It's like an attractor state or whatever they call it, right?
Yeah. It's like, kind of like a sink within the field. And, and it's such that in a sense, it's not literally a force field. It's something a little bit more interesting and tricky, but, force field kind of captures it. I mean, really what it is something like, if you were to place your hand close to the cake, there would be kind of like a force that would be like biasing your movements towards things that would, get you to eat it in a sense. So it's kind of, there's kind of this like action bias field. You can describe it. Things that are like pushing you to do things that are evolutionarily adaptive.
It's kind of, I was going to say it's kind of interesting because I think a lot about being receptive to information is also being able to sort of attract that kind of information. Like if you're being receptive to something, being open to the possibility of whatever kind of information you're trying to receive, in a sense, you're also saying like you're attracting it by being open to it. It's not that you're literally physically, pulling it to you, but in a sense, attentionally you are by remaining open to it. Do you sort of get what I'm getting at?
Yeah. No, and I mean, in some sense, like the attitude of being open to something has to do with kind of like letting that force field influence your body image. Right. Whereas being very defensive, right, is like you're tensing your muscles and you're not allowing those field lines to affect and bias your movement. I think like Dogan wants to say something.
Dogan. So just to interject, I guess, I mean, my own thoughts about how perception quality as a symbol in the brain is sort of, okay, for vision, you have your eyes, your retinas, they're sensitive to visible light. So, wavelengths at the scale of like 300 to 700 was angstroms or nanometers.
Nanometers, I think so.
So that's like a couple of thousand atoms, wide for each wavelength of light. And so anyway, so yeah, we have our retinas. We have most of it's concentrated on the foveal vision, the little bits inside the retina, and then we have 2 viewpoints to get parallax, so we can like infer depth. And then, you know, we have our eyes at the front and the processing for the visual field at the back of the head of the brain. And so there's a lot of processing that gets done in between and gets assembled into the visual cortex. So in the visual cortex, there's like a 3-dimensional representation of the world that gets populated by a certain color qualia, and that's our vision. So it's like there's this blank 3D canvas, and you know, color gets mapped into that space, and we have like a world model for like navigating. Also, if you close your eyes and you listen to sounds near you, you can kind of, we have stereo vision where you could map those sounds into that same 3D canvas, and now we have like audio qualia being mapped to that. So we have like color and audio being sourced into a 3-dimensional representation. And same thing for sense, you know, olfactory a little bit, although we don't, our olfactory sense is a little dull. But also, like you mentioned, proprioception. Anytime we have a tactile sensation, you close your eyes, you can feel in space where your skin is touching things. So that's like, okay, we have tactile sensations also being mapped into this 3-dimensional visual field. So I don't know, does that resonate as far as
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, something I'm gonna get into in a second is that I'm gonna hypothesize that essentially the tactile component is essential to actually get the geometry of the visual field. That they're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. But
right. So like blind people, they don't have any color quality to be mapped to this like 3-dimensional vision of what's around them, but their visual cortex is still like very active because it's mapping out the other qualia senses into that like holodeck essentially.
Yeah, essentially, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this is relevant. I was going to save this till the end actually, but I feel like it's relevant enough to what people are saying that I want to go ahead and bring it up. And then maybe we can discuss it more at length at the end if you're going to cover this a little bit. But it feels like there's an implicit assumption in all of this that somehow our brains are simulating the world in kind of like a classical computational sense. And it's a lot of the evidence from psychology and biology points to the fact that our brains are not simulating the world so much as error minimizing the world. And there's that classic study with the baseball players where for a long time people thought, how are people doing all this crazy physics in their head when they're catching a baseball? But it just turned out that they were just error minimizing between where their field of vision was and the baseball was. And I've thought of before about qualia and consciousness as sort of maybe the purpose of it being error minimization, in that if you have 2 different things and you need to treat them as 2 different things for whatever evolutionary reasons, like this is a poisonous berry, this is a healthy berry, it makes sense to have different qualia, and it makes sense to sort of seek out which qualia fits the item best, the sounds and sights and smells, and so which you should sort of phenomenologically experience that as. So I'm curious about your thought. Does Lehar have kind of a simulationist view of consciousness, or am I misunderstanding it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I should mention, one of the lineages for us in the Qualia Research Institute kind of memeplex is predictive processing, and also like Freeston and the free energy principle. And I would say that that's a really powerful explanatory framework. But in our conception, it's not enough to explain the unity of consciousness or qualia. In some sense, we flip it upside down, and essentially what we say is that moments of experience and kind of these like analog, integrated, unified moment of experience, which is a simulation of the environment and of ourselves, is used as part of a prediction error minimization algorithm, but it's not in and of itself the result of it. And there's a key difference there, and maybe I'll elaborate a little bit further in further slides. But yeah, it's a good point to put. In other words, I will just briefly answer that. Yes, we would be saying that the brain is actually creating the simulation, and then that simulation is playing the role of prediction error minimization, and it gets punished when it's bad at prediction error minimization in all sorts of ways, but is not in and of itself prediction error minimization. And in our view, you could create really powerful prediction error minimization systems that are not conscious and like just work in different ways. So yeah.
Just to clarify what you're saying real quick, and then I'll move to somebody else. Are you saying that in your view, like simulation is necessary for consciousness, and if it was just error minimization all the way down, you wouldn't necessarily call it consciousness? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, I actually am saying something even a little bit stronger, which is that having kind of this like unified internal representation that is simulating the environment is another necessary condition for our consciousness. But even that is not enough. Like you could have like a classical computer simulation of an internal world simulation, and that wouldn't necessarily give you consciousness either. But it's closer than just a system that is minimizing prediction errors. So it's almost kind of like a hierarchy of needs in a sense. And like, yeah, minimizing prediction errors is important. Having internal simulation is important, but neither of those are enough for actually a moment of experience.
Very fascinating. I'm going to have to chew on that quite a bit while you answer some of these other questions.
Cool. Michael, I know you have to get going, so ask your question real quick before you have to leave.
I have this idea that consciousness is a purely computational phenomenon, and it stems from the fact that we evolved to be conscious, and that implies that either philosophical zombies are impossible, or that conscious computation has some sort of significant advantages over unconscious computation, and I think it's actually the latter. So I suspect that there's like some subclass of problem solving like algorithms which are abnormally efficient, which are conscious essentially. And when I say like problem solving, you could give it some sort of like problem, like what am I looking at, and it would be able to figure like that out. So
yeah. No, I mean, and you're thinking very much along the right lines. I think indeed in our papers, like one of the things that we explain is that like any theory of consciousness must be able to explain, like for example, like what are the causal effects of consciousness, like what is the benefit of being conscious? Otherwise, like there wouldn't be an evolutionary reasons for us to be conscious. But essentially we arrive at that is not just a certain type of computation, and although the devil's in the details, because it depends on how you define computation, but at least classically defined within a Turing completeness paradigm, we actually would argue that it's not enough. There's no way in particular to program a digital computer, for reasons that I can go into quite a bit of depth, that will actually get you like unified moments of experience. The key, in a sense, is going to be to kind of like generalize our conception of computation to be able to include, arguments such as, like in what way you can recruit a physical system for useful computation, such that then you can ask the question, like what is like special about the physical system of a moment of experience that is useful for something, that evolution would actually recruit it for something. It's a subtle distinction, but it ends up being like really significant. And maybe I'll elaborate a little bit further in the next slides.
I don't really think it makes sense to say that like consciousness is like uncomputable in that sense, and that like a computer would not be capable of it, because from my perspective, the brain is just like another computer. So I don't see why you couldn't just like make a computer program which experiences like the qualia of like red or green or some color that humans can't see. Yeah, like elaborate on why you think that like consciousness should be like, I guess, uncomputable or unsimulatable.
Yes. I mean, it's a deep rabbit hole, but yeah, I can say some things in the meantime. So, I mean, one key thing is the very conception of computation. right? So for some people, if you were to ask, people in kind of the Wolfram type of like space, they might say, well, trivially everything is a computation, right? Like the universe is computational. Like of course, like if the universe is computational, how could there be anything non-computational? But the devil really is in the details here, because there is definitely a sense in which the universe is not computational, and there's other senses in which it is computational, depending on the precise way in which you define it. And in particular, the universe has like very strange properties that don't seem to agree with at least kind of like a naive conception of computation as a cellular automaton. In particular, one thing that I think we can be fairly certain of is that the universe is not, let's say, like something that emerges out of a like a standard, let's say, like Conway's Game of Life type of computer, where you have like, okay, like every dot is either a 1 or a 0, and there's some kind of like rule that integrates information of its immediate environment to determine like its next state. And the reason why, the universe is not like that is because you can set up various experiments where light, for example, seems to be doing something much more interesting than that. It's doing something like exploring all the possible paths and all the possible interactions, and then choosing the one that minimizes energy. And there's definitely a case to be made that, okay, like maybe this is computational in the classical sense, but not in physical space, maybe in configuration space, where you take into account like all of the possible paths. And Wolfram would kind of like argue it from that perspective and talk about the rule, that's kind of like this underlying cellular automaton. But even there's a little bit of kind of like sleight of hand, almost kind of a magician, where like you may get the impression, okay, so that means the universe can be a cellular automaton. But again, the devil's in the details, because the type of cellular automaton that this becomes is one that has essentially kind of this variable bucket size, where like, okay, like how much of the cellular automaton you have to consider all at once to predict the next step is variable. And something like in the Rowleyat construction, you have to take into account all of the possible paths and then make a decision based on that. I would argue that kind of like widening of, okay, if the rule set contains this clause that in such and such circumstance, you have to take into account an arbitrarily large kind of like set of branches, then that's not really a cellular automaton, right? Because you have kind of like this variable size rule, right? And okay, if you expand kind of like the sense of computation to include variable bucket sizes or variable rule sizes that can grow arbitrarily large, then yes, okay, in that case, the universe is computable. It's just that it's not really of a type that is like a Turing machine. It's like something more sophisticated with kind of like, variable bucket size. And I think most people, once you kind of explain to that level of detail, they will say like, okay, I guess it's probably not computational in the classical sense at the very least. And I guess like, the sort of thing that I would be arguing for is that if it is a computational system of that type, that does give you the opportunity for something kind of like a binding to happen at the physical level, because the thing that would allow that binding would be something like that the rule set includes the possibility of like having to take into account arbitrarily large regions of the graph in order to make an update. So like maybe in the brain, we're kind of like one of these like special corner cases where you have to take into account a whole lot of information in order to make the next update. And that aspect of taking all of that information into account simultaneously is perhaps what is causing the macroscopic binding for a lot of information all at once. But that's a very, very different type of system than something like a Turing machine, where literally you're just taking into account, the immediate neighbors, for example, and a discrete rule set. But I mean, it's a deep rabbit hole. So it's something for which we definitely might need a longer conversation.
I had a quick comment, actually.
Before.
I don't know if this is related, but there's the phenomenon, where like your sense of motion is can be influenced by the visual field. So like if you're sitting in a train and like another train is moving by, like if the train is still, but like another train is moving by, you might feel like you're moving even though you're not. And then the reason I brought this up actually is because at Florida Atlantic University, I met this guy, Adar Pala.
I think he's on the
Is
he's on the
here?
video. Yeah, he's on the stream.
Is he with us? Okay. Yeah, he mentioned he has another one. Hey, he has another one he found where if you're on a treadmill and you get off the treadmill, like your sense of motion changes. So I don't think that's super relevant to what you're going to talk about, but it's just it's interesting how other things, like basically the various things you're perceiving can be influenced by other senses. So sense of sound can be influenced by, another one is sound perception can be influenced by vision. And
yeah, I mean, I think like the core thing that consciousness is doing, it's essentially like integrating fields of different dimensionalities, and effectively it works as a hologram. So, and I don't think of it actually like metaphorically. I think it might actually be like in some literal sense, actually like some hologram. There's this overall conceptual framework we discussed at QRI called the brain as a nonlinear optical computer. And once you involve, like nonlinear optics, then you have, this kind of like, you can tap into this property of physics where like, okay, like a system is exploring all of the possible states simultaneously. And the thing that you get is actually the superposition of all the available states. Is not classical computation or not classical physics in quite a fundamental sense, because you're essentially not computing kind of like just based on like spatial neighborhoods. If you interpret it as part of a cellular automaton, you will have to take into account essentially neighborhoods in configuration space, right? Which is like this much, much, much larger space. The same if you want to make a classic simulation of quantum mechanics, you end up relying on a lot of hacks. I mean, like what you end up doing is kind of like classically simulating all of these possible paths, and then like superimposing them. But like the runtime complexity of that is like much larger than like what you would have to do in physics, right? In physics, hey, like it will explore all of those paths for you within just one unit of time. Whereas like if you wanted to simulate it, you would have to like, okay, independently simulate all of those paths, then add them together in a way that it doesn't scale in the same way, right? Like there's like a behavioral difference, right? You have to kind of like slow down everything else in order to kind of like create that illusion of, okay, you're walking at the same speed. But I guess I'll continue with the slide. I mean, this actually relates to the predictive processing kind of aspect of how the brain is computing information. But as a conceptual framework, I think it's important to kind of like realize that your visual field is constantly trying to explain the information that is in front of it. And I would argue that there's kind of like an energy model here can be quite effective at kind of like pointing at what's happening, where let's say things that are surprising, to a first approximation, they raise kind of like an energy parameter that makes things slightly unstable, right? Like if you see something that is completely out of place, like it looks more salient, right? Like if you're looking at a bunch of trees and then all of a sudden you see a tiger, you weren't expecting that, right? Like that pops up and kind of like directs your attention. There's a prediction error. The rest of the scene didn't predict that you were going to see this one component. And then there's like ways in which the system tries to calm down. And the argument here is that actually this process of like the system trying to calm down is indirectly actually a process that is doing something like Bayesian inference. That to reduce the energy of the system, it's going to be trying to latch on to energy sinks, things that minimize its energy. And we are set up in such a way that this energy minimization process actually is very good at minimizing prediction errors. And there's kind of like two very large categories of these energy sinks. One is symmetries. So things that are like almost symmetrical, they can kind of like snap into symmetry. Seeing something tessellated is like a very common kind of attractor in the visual field. Even hallucinating a tessellation, like, if you see a wall for the first time and you would think, oh my gosh, it's a perfectly repeating pattern, then it takes a little bit of time to realize, like, no, maybe it's not actually perfectly repeating, right? But like the hallucination of seeing the perfect repetition is a very kind of like native basic inference that we make because it's like simpler in a sense. So symmetry actually encodes in a sense, what people call like inductive biases, right? Is like when in doubt, assume that it's symmetrical, and then add imperfections to it to try to make a better representation. But you get kind of the simplest model possible. And then the other type of energy sink is semantic content. I mean, it's like things that you can recognize in the scene, things that you have seen before. And as a conceptual framework, I think this is helpful to explain some of the things such as like psychedelic hallucinations or hallucinations on meditation, where you get the system to be in a very highly energized state, and then to calm down, like your visual system is going to try to latch on to either things that it can recognize, which you may hallucinate clowns or trees or an elephant, and also symmetries, because again, symmetries work as energy sinks, right? So I think like a lot of the hallucinatory content of, let's say, like DMT experiences can be understood as these kind of hybrids of things that are symmetrical and things that you can recognize, things that you've seen before in previous contexts. But okay, like what I'm building towards is this idea that, hey, actually, this is a co-processing that is happening both in the tactile field and in the visual field. And maybe one thing to kind of like share, it's an anecdote of kind of like just like the power of vibration, and how like it actually kind of like is really all encompassing for visual perception as well. So there is this small apparatus. I think you can't get it anymore. At least, I mean, I'm sure you can get it on eBay, but they don't sell it anymore. I don't know what happened to that company, but it's essentially something called a SUBPAC, which is kind of this backpack. You can connect it to any AV cable and run music through it. And what's really interesting, it's like it renders in body vibration any sound between 10 hertz and approximately 200 hertz. And one of the kind of like early experiments that I did, years ago was just to see what happens if I do kind of like for 20 minutes every day, I just put like 40 hertz in my body. Just kind of like, okay, like what does it learn? What does it mean to learn kind of a 40 hertz vibration? And well, two things, were very noticeable from these. One is that, kind of like stabilizing a 40 hertz vibration, actually like, impairs kind of like visualization skills. There's like a lot of like visual scenes that are complex that if you try to imagine while experiencing 40 hertz, is very difficult. Like the 40 hertz in some sense kind of flattens your ability to visualize things. That's on the one hand. And then on the other is that, I started having sleep paralysis experiences where I would be just kind of like stuck in these like 40 hertz vibration for, like periods of 20 minutes. And so I actually like stopped, consuming 40 hertz because it was producing this very strange side effect. But it's kind of like the hint that I got from that is, hey, like however you choose to treat your body, like if you treat your body as a field, as something that is vibrating in a consistent, regular way, eventually your body learns to emulate that behavior. It learns to instantiate it, and you can kind of like get stuck in kind of a 40 hertz attractor, which has both a tactile element and a visual element. They seem to kind of like interlock into like a strange phase. And this is kind of like visually kind of like representing what I mean here is like, if you had kind of this like powerful cinematic. Sorry, go ahead, please.
I may, so, when I go surfing or something, and you feel the motion of the waves, and then like later that night I go to sleep, and then like I feel those waves again. Like my body's trying to emulate what I felt during the day while I'm sleeping at night. So is that kind of the same phenomenon? Like you have this 40 hertz, and then your body's like trying to redo that, and
yes,
messes with your sleep maybe.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Sleep paralysis, especially, it's like if people say that it's like setting a sensation on the chest. And so if the 40 hertz are like going through your chest and you kind of have a sensation on your chest that mind's trying to recreate while you're asleep, and it might be sparking sleep paralysis in that mechanism.
Yes. Essentially, yes. And I mean, if you imagine kind of like the surfing quality as well, or like if I remember the day after I first did was it like scuba diving? Yeah, this thing scuba diving, like just the whole feeling of being like inside the ocean, right? And like kind of like being gently rocked. Your body learns that, and then you can hallucinate it. And but then the critical thing to notice that when you enter those kind of like very embodied vibrational states, it affects also your visual processing. Like there's some kind of like interlocking also that happens into like what scenes, like I'd imagine if, after surfing, everything looks also a little bit kind of like wobbly, like tuning into those vibrations. Like it's easier to imagine kind of like water because it's like more wobbly than just like a solid ground. They kind of like come together. Okay, so like, I think like one very important hint in a sense is that what we might call kind of like phases of consciousness, these kind of like slabs of like, okay, vibratory sensations. That's like something that we have to explain. And there's actually a whole bunch of them. I made this chart to kind of like illustrate a little bit of kind of, okay, like there's actually a lot of these like phases, 40 hertz is just one of them. A very, I think like broad example is like, the jhānas. The jhānas are like these like meditation states. And, some people compare them to kind of like different textures of clothing, that if you absorb yourself into the first jhana, which is kind of this like body pleasure, there's a sense in which that's kind of like cotton or like maybe even silk all throughout your body. And it's completely synesthetic. I mean, like the moment you enter to what those states, it also affects like the texture of the visual field. They're kind of like two sides of the same coin. At least in the moment, it feels like very clear. But, like every other state of consciousness, you could kind of like associate it with a different texture. Like how is your body doing? Like if you feel very inflamed, you just recovered from COVID, you may feel kind of this like, like coarse, irritated, kind of like stuffed type of texture. Or like, if you're
you mean how Anakin says sand is rough, irritating, coarse, and it gets everywhere?
Yes, something like that, exactly.
George Lucas was on to something.
Exactly. So yeah, and essentially, all of these different textures are like possible, states of consciousness, phases of consciousness that, just as like phases of matter, like these might be like, okay, like phases of visual, tactile synesthesia that are important to explain. And like one way of thinking, I've kind of like, okay, like your overall integrated kind of like moment of experience is that you have like a bunch of these different fabrics. I mean, usually they tend to be like mixed fabrics. So you may have like one patch like being very smooth and another patch, being more rough. Like some part of you might be kind of like sandpaper. And I would argue that, actually like what your mood is like, you could trace it to, hey, like what is the patchwork of textures that is currently animating your experience? That if you were to suddenly replace your body sensation with just the silk, it's very difficult to not be in a very positive, friendly mood. Whereas, if you replace it with something really coarse, it's like, okay, like that affects every aspect of your cognition, all the way you simulate possible situations. Even, the way you render possible social interactions, if you yourself feel very coarse, right, you're going to imagine yourself, visualize yourself interacting with others. And what that will feel like will be impacted by the texture that you're projecting onto that scene, right? So all of this is to say is that, this, I think like, understanding your moments of experience is kind of like being patterned by these tactile textures. It might be very generative and potentially explanatory for like what a mood consists of.
I was just curious, if you cannot visualize due to aphantasia, would the result be the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would imagine yes, although there might be quite a bit of like individual variability. What I would suspect is that even in the case of aphantasia, the way in which kind of like the different textures appear in your tactile field, it definitely still influences mood, and it still influences what visualizations are possible or like how you interpret visual stimulation. It's just that maybe because of the aphantasia, like internally triggering a visual simulation might be more difficult. But I would strongly suspect that, the correspondence with the tactile and the visual field is the same, because I think it's like something more universal than whether you have aphantasia or not. I'm gonna kind of like suggest that in some sense, like the visual and tactile regions of our experience are actually kind of like two sides of the same coin. And that like the reason we are conscious, I mean, this is still kind of like shaping up. I still haven't figured out the best way to argue exactly this, but I'm making baby steps in the right direction, hopefully, is that it's actually a hologram. So like one of the properties of holograms, right, is that you can encode information of like a certain dimensionality in another dimensionality, right? Like in the classic example of a two-dimensional hologram that it encodes a little bit of depth, right? Like, of course, it's not like literally two-dimensional, right? Like a two-dimensional hologram, it does have a little bit of depth, so you're going to get like an interference pattern engraved. At the same time, effectively, it's almost completely flat, right? Like you can almost kind of like encode this three-dimensional space in an effectively flat surface. So what I'm going to suggest is that the role of consciousness, the role of like being aware, having a world simulation, is to play this nexus between sensory fields of different dimensionalities. And in particular, I think like maybe the easiest to study is effectively going to be the visual to tactile mapping. And I'm going to suggest that, hey, like the tactile modules of our brain are interacting with this hologram in kind of like with a 3D surface, whereas let's say like the visual component of our brain is interacting with this hologram with a two-dimensional representation. But because they're interacting with the same hologram, they're interacting with the same object, is just interacting with it slightly different ways in such a way that you can essentially allow like nearly instantaneous communication between those two fields. I suppose like from a machine learning point of view, I would claim that, yeah, like a consciousness effectively is kind of like a physically very adaptive way of solving something like an autoencoder implementation, where like you're channeling the system through this lower dimensional bottleneck that is kind of like forced to represent information of fields of different dimensionalities. In particular, something like the DMT state of consciousness is just very, very commonly reported as essentially producing these kind of like symmetrical structures, symmetrical patterns in the visual field. But critically, and this is something for you to verify or ask your friend psychonauts, is that every symmetrical structure on DMT also has a tactile component associated to it. I mean, in some sense, navigating the symmetries of DMT space is intricately related with like navigating your proprioception. That like for every kind of like pattern of resonance, whether it's like 2D or 3D or even higher dimensional in the visual field, in DMT that comes together with a pattern of resonance in the body. And in some sense, it's kind of like you're tuning this hologram that relates the two-dimensional space to the three-dimensional embodied feeling. And it was most stark of all, I think, on DMT because of the heterogeneity of the patterns, that your body image may actually like fragment into these different buckets, each of those having like a characteristic resonance with a characteristic frequency, characteristic symmetry, and also being projected into the visual field. And so this very strange thing happens where like by moving kind of like the symmetries in the visual field, you can kind of like operate on your tactile sensations. I mean, like that is actually a fairly common kind of like reported hallucination is, let's say, you encounter entities that kind of like help you heal something inside you, so to speak, by rearranging geometric objects, right? It's like, hey, why is moving with geometric objects in, the 3D space potentially healing in any way? And as far as I can tell, essentially what that process is doing is kind of like fine-tuning your tactile representations using your visual field as kind of like a tuning modality. So it's kind of like you're tuning these three-dimensional resonances using a two-dimensional resonance board, as it were. Critically...
Question.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, when I feel like corduroy, basically the texture of that is like a bunch of parallel lines. And so you feel that with your tactile sensation, and there's like a representation of that geometrically. So is that what you're saying? Like when you're in this DMT state, like you see all these textures around, but you also like get a tactile sensation associated with them as well?
Yes, exactly. So for example, you may hallucinate like a corduroy entity over here and like a silk entity over here.
Yeah.
And if you pay attention, you will realize that, hey, oh my gosh, I'm actually feeling this corduroy entity in my body over here. And the silk entity, I'm feeling it here. I mean, people describe it as like, in some sense, kind of like they realize their body's inhabited by these entities. I think like a parsimonious, prosaic way of analyzing this is that you're kind of like breaking down the patterns of connection in your proprioception, and then you're projecting those patterns of connection into the visual field and kind of rendering them. And then, yeah, very strange things happen. Like if those two entities, let's say, talk to each other and they resolve whatever issue they have, that will manifest as essentially the patches of corduroy and the patches of silk, equalizing with each other, or like mixing together, or one of them passing on the texture from one to the other, for example. So yes, it's kind of like you're mapping the body to the visual field and then having almost using the visual field as a Rubik's cube to kind of like reorganize the textures in the body. I'll just wrap up quickly saying that, yeah, like, observationally, all of these patterns, they seem to kind of emit waves. And the more coherent or symmetrical one of these structures is, the more it can kind of like coherently radiate its information to the rest of the experience. So essentially, any of these patterns of coherence functions as both kind of a texture of experience, but also kind of like a witness. It effectively becomes kind of like as a witness of the scene. And I think like this is also one reason why, in the state, it may feel like, this space is inhabited by a lot of different entities. If you pay close attention, it is because each of the patterns of coherence functions as a witness of the scene. It's almost kind of they each have their own perspectives. Which is, just to kind of like evoke this idea that, hey, actually the symmetries themselves are the observers of the experience. And, to a first approximation, when you look at like the very rich, complex DMT experience that is tactile and visual in nature, what I'm going to propose is that the way kind of like the screen of consciousness is constructed is by each of these symmetries essentially is being the camera for the rest of the experience. And what it is like to be one of these experiences is the superposition of the perspectives of all of these different patches of coherence, which, it's ultimately something completely testable in terms of modeling, for example, like modeling patterns of coherence in a system of coupled oscillators, and then predicting what would that look like internally, right? Like what you would do is like, okay, you find the patches of coherence and then you see how they all perceive each other, how they all can affect each other. And the overall claim is that, like the actual emergent quality of experience is this superposition of all the perspectives that all of the observers within the experience have of each other. So something I called, the composition of subfields. I think this is it as far as the presentation
Perfect.
goes. Yeah.
Because this could be a really interesting transition to when we ask our panelists, Dr. Hahn, Barinholtz, and Eliade, about did they see that type of shit when they took DMT?
Not to
Hahn
out
first.
anybody, but yes.
Fantastic discussion. First, I just want to give a round of applause while everybody's here. Amazing stuff that you've really kicked off a lot of great ideas, I'm sure, and everybody who's listening. I've got like a few pages of notes here, stuff I'd love to discuss with you. One of the things you said more recently is coupled oscillators, and Elon knows that's very close to my heart. Something I spent a lot of time. We build a lot of models together, trying to understand the binding problem, as you mentioned, and we're a big fan of this idea of binding by synchrony. That we need to think about time and the dynamics of these patterns as kind of holding them together in ways that the so-called grandma cells can't account for. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's awesome. I think synchrony is definitely part of the picture. I think there's definitely a lot of like neurophysiological evidence that synchronic activity of like feature processors contribute to kind of like them being, or is a necessary component for kind of like local binding to happen. And I think like any kind of like model of the brain with systems of coupled oscillators, probably synchrony will be like really, really, really key. But at least from a kind of like a deeper kind of like a theoretical perspective, we are of the mind that synchrony is not enough, but it is an enabling factor. One key reason, although this is itself like a rabbit hole, but it's one of the problems with synchrony as kind of like the ultimate glue, as it were, is that it's not a frame invariant, right? Like whether two neurons fire at the same time depends on your frame of reference. Now, of course, to make that matter, you have to be moving really, really fast to actually
relativistic, like sort of relativistic cognition.
Yes, but and I recognize it's kind of ridiculous to bring relativistic considerations to the brain. At the same time, if we're looking for something kind of that will ontologically actually create this unity, and the unity is kind of in the ground of being, as it were, as opposed to something that only looks unified from a certain perspective. We think like something more fundamental needs to also be happening. Which is I mean that would segue into like the whole conversation on our solution to the boundary problem, which is topological in nature, which I'm happy to also delve into. But yeah, that would be the the overall response.
I definitely have a kind of I guess a iconoclastic view of the entire nature of the problem to start with. So what I call into question is the very claim of unity of consciousness. I think that's well, I have to back up a little bit. So the perspective that I have is that the sort of the hard problem of consciousness, the subjectivity, is primarily a linguistic one, and language is it's a longer diatribe. It's not my floor. I don't want to get I don't want to superimpose my position, but I think what you're trying to account for in some sense is you're trying to sort of account for subjectivity at the same time as in one fell swoop, sort of the unity as being a kind of so there's these sort of mutually sort of superimposed perspectives or something that are just close enough, I guess, in some sense, that that something emerges from that we'd call maybe unity and subjectivity. I'm first, I guess, what I'd like to do to start is to just push back a tiny bit on. Well, not a tiny bit. Let's have it. Why do we even say who? No, when I say we, the problem is we're the LLMs talking, in my view. So it's problematic. But the LLM in so the language, what we're doing when we're talking about this is the talking has access to the multiple sensory modalities. I can talk about my vision, right, and I can talk about my audition. But does my audition know about my vision, and does my vision know about my audition? But I kind of start with that, and I think all of qualia are sort of sensory in nature, and I don't know that I agree with, and it's a fairly recent position I've taken. But once I came to it, I actually found it hard to get out of it. That there really is a truly unity of consciousness, such that you have to account for it in the first place. The subjectivity is another matter. It's certainly whether that's the same problem or a different problem. I think it is a different problem. But because I think your overall perspective is in a sense primarily inspired by sort of the core almost axiom, the phenomenological axiom of unity of consciousness. I want to push back on that because it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit in relation to my theoretical framework, where I say, okay, language is the thing that thinks they're unified because it has access to all of them, sort of the theme in the brain kind of idea, but it's only linguistic, really, only that we can talk, we can report on vision, we can report on audition, but vision cannot report on audition, and audition can't report on vision. It's just that language can do both. So I wanted to just put it out there. I don't need to throw a huge wrench. Sorry?
Only the reportability engine can report.
Exactly.
Andres, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, I know what you're talking about. So let me provide kind of like the approach here. So first of all is like acknowledging that a lot of notions of unity of consciousness are definitely naive, and I kind of like started with this concept of like the Cartesian theater perspective of experience, where like really there's like a little guy, and then there's like the theater that you're experiencing, and I think it's like fair to argue that like something like that is probably not happening. That that's kind of like part of the content of the simulation, as opposed to like actually that happening somewhere in the brain, a little theater, so to speak. And like Daniel Dennett, made a kind of like a strong push for what he called the multi-draft theory of consciousness, where consciousness is maybe kind of like fame in the brain. There's like a lot of different ways of stringing together the information, and then after a while you say something, and then that's what you remember. It's kind of like the most popular take on like what is it that you were doing is the one that becomes canonical. And I think like actually that can very much well be going on, and something that I don't push back against is the idea that experience is less unified than what we may think. I very much think that this idea that is like, okay, like constantly every bit of information in your Cartesian theater is like fully, rendered. I think that's not the case. However, there is at least some significant, non-trivial aspect to the unity of consciousness that I do think needs to be explained. And I'll explain it this way. So one of the reasons why the unity of consciousness is often put into question is because people oftentimes will say something like, well, if you pay really close attention to the nature of your experience, you only really experience kind of like one bit of information at a time, which is like whatever you're paying attention to. And like, even when you're paying attention to something that looks like broad, in some sense, you're only paying, like, because you're only paying to one thing at a time, at no point kind of like the information is truly getting integrated. However, there's two kind of like standard replies to these. So one is, that is A, with kind of like their standard kind of like laser type of attention, which is like the normal everyday type of attention. But there's many other types of attention, especially in exotic states of consciousness, where you may have like multiple kind of like flashlights of attention simultaneously, which is not common, but it's definitely a possible experience, which kind of provides a experiential counterexample. But even if attention necessarily was just kind of like one flashlight, just kind of like focusing in one region at a time, the very meaning of what you're paying attention to is getting conditioned by the context. So, and this puts to the forefront the importance of distinguishing between attention and awareness, right? Like awareness is kind of like the automatic, completely effortless kind of like field of sensations, and then attention is within that field, you're selecting some parts and you're like making them unified. You're adding kind of extra connections. What I would claim is that, the very meaning of what you're paying attention to doesn't exist without the context where it's happening. And so even though that kind of unity is not the naive, like, hey, it's all in a Cartesian theater, it's still some phenomenal unity of some sort. It's like, hey, I'm putting together the faint sensation of the background together with what I'm paying attention to give meaning to it. And that is like, I would estimate at least a couple megabytes of information that is kind of like simultaneously happening. And it's kind of like that simultaneous coexistence of information that needs some kind of like accounting. Is like, on the one hand, how is that physically possible? And then on the second hand, why evolution would bother to use a system that does that.
Okay, yeah. So I guess you're not making the harder claim, the broader claim of sort of fundamental unity of consciousness. Well, modalities, I guess, cross modality, for example, like that's you're talking about kind of you're not just consciously, you're not certainly perceiving one bit at a time, right? I think that seems like a very reasonable kind of argument. A second thought, I think it's related, is, and I think it's, have you seen this paper? There's this cool paper. It's called Harnessing the Universal Geometry of Embeddings. It's a pretty recent paper. It just came out, I think it's about 2 weeks now. And what it's trying to get at is they're specific to, it's a paper specific to large language models. But it's about being able to go from one radically different embedding to another embedding without having starting with, you don't actually have the map. You actually have to find the map because there's a universal geometry amongst them. And to me, this sort of leads the way to where you might get sort of cross-modal or cross-linguistic to modal kind of translation of some sort, a shared space. It's kind of a shared space, a shared latent space, where there's some kind of sort of universal geometry between these highly distinct systems. And I'm wondering if that sort of maybe rings a bell. Maybe I'm just kind of seeing I've got a hammer, so I see nails everywhere. But it seems like it might be kind of along the lines of from a phenomenology for a second. Let's talk about functionally, the brain has to resolve this absurdly high dimensional multimodal problem of information integration in order to do stuff, in order to sort of choose the next action and so on. Where is that? How is that integration happening? There's a lot of physiological and some psychophysical kind of research, which is woefully unsatisfying computationally. It's just like, what happens here, or something like that, or there's this phenomenon, and so on, as is common in these fields. and what I think you're after in some ways is sort of a computational, really fundamentally computational account. And I do think that there might be some fruit, not just in that particular perspective, but thinking about the functional integration that has to happen, because I think the way you have been describing it is primarily in terms of trying to, like, I'm trying to account for the phenomenology, and with function being, I don't want to say secondary, but to what extent, do you feel like your perspective that you're discussing, this sort of almost, these fields in close proximity, are you thinking of it functionally? Are you thinking of it in terms of then that has utility for X, Y, Z in terms of behavioral outcomes, things like that? Is that sort of essential to what you're after?
Yeah. Let me mention a couple things in this space. One is I mean, one could make the case. I've definitely seen this been argued a number of times that, for example, like visual qualia is emergent out of is kind of like very adaptive for specific types of information processing. Like, for example, like maybe like 3D visual information. And in some sense, one could argue is like, okay, like the type of sensory modality that we're talking about is kind of like sensations that are just like very optimal at representing kind of the data structure of those senses. Importantly, though, there is the case of synesthesia, right? Like, so at least you could consider situations where, okay, somebody has kind of like wired the brain quite differently, such that when they open their eyes, they experience like tactile sensations, and when they feel sensations, they experience visual sensations in their visual field. I don't think that would be a very adaptive mapping, but it seems to be possible, right? In other words, I don't think it's kind of the data structure of the sensory streams that is in some sense selecting the type of qualia that is being used to render them. Is almost kind of the other way around. It's more like there is the possibility from a kind of like ontological standpoint to use like visual qualia, and then evolution found that it was uniquely good at representing visual information. But maybe in other species, they, like maybe the mantis shrimp or something like that, who knows, like maybe they experience like tactile sensations through their eyes, and maybe that was just the more adaptive data structure for that particular nervous system. Which is to say, I mean, and I guess like I want to make a nod to the point that in a lot of these like very large machine learning tasks, oftentimes, right, like the algorithm doesn't matter as much as like the structure of the data, and like there's a bunch of different neural networks systems that will arrive at the same internal representation even if they look very different, right? And that kind of like argues for kind of like the primacy of the sensory stream, right? Like the structure of the sensory stream.
One quick comment on that. Is that, would you, in another way of phrasing that, could you say that's sort of this idea that you can have the same goal but get to it by different means?
Yeah. And is that some of those means are much more adaptive. So the picture, maybe the picture that is the most helpful is kind of grounding this in this concept of like reservoir computing, right? So I would argue something along the lines of, okay, like maybe visual qualia, let's say it's maps onto like a particular like nonlinear optical circuit, and a general brain, as it were, starts with a lot of kind of like classical neurons, but also these kind of like special neurons that, for example, allow like nonlinear standing wave patterns to be shared between many of those neurons, as long as they have like that property. What I would be arguing is that in the process of learning, there is a recruitment process where the network as a whole figures out, hey, if I use all of these special neurons that have this kind of like ability to connect optical circuitry, that ends up being what gets recruited for visual processing. But depending on your life history, depending on what was adaptive when you were young, maybe those circuits could have been used for something else. But that the actual qualia of visual sensation is at a very raw physical level what those circuits can actually enable. In other words,
exact opposite views. So cool.
I actually wanted to get to Will for a second on that, because one of the things I think about is back to that conversation about our sort of the way we're receptive to information, and it's almost like in an attractor state kind of basin thing, a sink that, you know, lets it in. Is that what kinds of information can be taken in through that medium that could be positive or, you know, beneficial information, or maybe less helpful information? So Dr. On actually talks a lot about info hazards and, you know, mimetic viruses, thought forms. I know even people like Michael Levin have kind of, in fact, I think that's actually the name of Michael Levin's blog. I think it's like thoughtforms.life, if you've seen that. Yeah. Andres, you had your thing posted on there as well. So I'm curious what Dr. On has to say about
I'm calling whenever, after that, I do want to get back to this real quick.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up reservoir computing, and I just got to mention, while I've got the time, I really appreciate your kind of physics approach to neuroscience. I think one of the things that's held the field back in the last, 40 or more years is I kind of rag that neuroscience became applied chemistry. And it's very, very powerful paradigm for drug discovery and things like that, but it really missed the boat on a lot of the things. So I think simple stuff like the holographic theory, even simple theories of computation and analog and all that kind of stuff, unfortunately, that's completely missing from any kind of mainstream neuroscience or brain science or psychology education tracks. So it's really refreshing because I think there's a lot of fruit on that tree, so to speak. In terms of the reservoir, I like what you're saying. In terms of like found, it reminds me of the idea of found poetry, right? When you just sort of find interesting stuff out there, and that you might have these neuronal ensembles that just from the combinatorics of it happen to do something really interesting, and then they get recruited. And I think that's one of the best ways to explain, you know, animal behavior and human behavior, that we don't need these massive training sets, and we don't need, you know, eons equivalent of training, because there's these kind of things already there, these found functions. But that also, in the thought form direction that Addie brought up, and I think this is something close to your heart, is sort of the psycho-fauna. You know, are these things really alive? And I like to think of the brain as kind of a rich enough substrate in terms of the number of patterns it would instantiate, as being at least as rich in state space as a primordial ocean or kind of a rainforest or something like that, and that critters could survive there, right? We might see, and maybe they're ephemeral, sort of non-corporeal, pseudo-digital kind of whatever. Maybe they have sort of, they're fleeting, and they're literally figments of your imagination, but it might be fruitful them to look at them in kind of a biological framework and kind of catalog them like a 19th century naturalist way.
Absolutely. I want I want to mention something there, which is yeah, I mean, like the entities that you encountered on DMT, that is my basic interpretation, is that you're really changing the patterns of connectivity, and you're allowing this kind of Cambrian explosion of mini patterns to arise that are essentially, yeah, recruiting all of these like inbuilt kind of like functionality for new purposes. And typically they will be kind of like little energetic parasites in a sense that are trying to kind of like eat to the rest of the organism for their own survival, and they have all sorts of sneaky strategies to make that happen.
Look at them nodding their heads. Look at them nodding their heads in agreement.
Yeah. I'm gonna probably
that's my other point. So
I call them hypo organisms, because they're like viruses. Maybe they can't quite survive on their own, right? They're really dependent on this other organism to survive.
Yeah. And if I mean, one metaphor is like right, like if a country, I'm not sure if this is a very tasteful metaphor, but like you can imagine, like if a country is doing really well, right, like everybody identifies with the country, like the country is kind of the religion of the members. But if the country starts to break down, there's a point in which the people making up that country will kind of like eventually say like, oh, why bother, right? Like, and they reconceptualize like the boundary of their selves. Like, maybe I'm just my town, right? Like maybe just my family. Screw everybody else. This is too much to handle. And you see this defection within the broader organism because, hey, like just putting energy to sustain the larger organism is just not paying them locally anymore. And I think, yeah, things such as like, like exorcisms and things like that is like, yeah, somebody got like filled up with these organisms that were kind of like fed up with their ego, as it were. Like now they're trying to just survive on their own. And well, you've got to do some realignment. Say like, hey, buddy, if you're gonna be in this body, you've got to be part of the the religion of the whole.
Well, I think there's a
If
lot
I
of
could
people
butt in,
for psychotherapy and the kind of revolutions we need in mental health. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
if I can butt in real quickly, something worth noting is that when we're talking about hyperorganisms versus individual organisms and their relative selfishness, sometimes the individual organisms being selfish is good for the hyperorganisms. And there's lots of examples of this where sort of one country tried to invade this other country, and they had a much harder time of it because the country wasn't unified under sort of one government or one king. There were all these separate clans, so they had to get through each clan. They couldn't just hit the royal family and be done with it. And there's examples of this in biology and stuff as well. And I think it's important to note.
Fascinating.
Perfect. That was a perfect
transition
to bridge all of this. So you're talking about like a society of mind. So yes, we've got sort of this idea, this ecosystem of these different. I think of them as dynamical processes. You can think of them happening literally in these sort of neural substrate as dynamical processes that are maybe even competitive, but they have lives of their own. We found one. We caught it inside a test tube, and it's language. The reason I'm obsessed with language is not because I'm obsessed with language. I never had a particular interest in language, frankly, in my entire career. Although now I certainly have an interest in language per se, but it's because we actually are observing in the large language models a computational system running itself. It's autogenerative. It's the statistics, the distribution of the words in the corpus, so to speak. But it's not even a corpus because it's spoken and all that. But whatever. What the LLMs learn is a structure, an actual sort of mathematical structure that generates itself. Is that what's another word? What generates, I guess, a meaningful linguistic outputs, and we see that the language contains within itself this sort of autogenerative property, and so we've actually got one, and we can think of that playing out in the brain, right? It's the brain, it's the words, actually, strangely enough, these informational things, these symbolic things. That's what it's so cool that it's language in some sense, because it's like the least intuitive one, because it's like words where they're in the brain. Yes, they're in the brain, fighting it out, and not fighting it out. Yes, fighting it out as well, probably. But there is this dynamical system. We can describe it literally as a dynamical system now. That's happening in the neural substrate, and it's producing linguistic behavior at least. And so you're mentioned. So I think when I think about the modalities, perception, and things like this. I tend to think, well, okay, if embeddings, embeddings can be generative in this kind of self-regenerative process where you output and then the output becomes your input and so on and so forth. Could we account for other cognitive modalities, cognitive mechanisms the same way? And I'm inclined to think, well, like vision and audition, similarly, that they're built by the world. The language is built by society in some strange way. I don't understand it, but that's how it works. Whereas vision is built by the world, and it's the dynamics of the world that define the embedding space that has this specific statistical structure that then allows us to, in our brains, to carry on. So the process runs itself. Right? It's Williams. These are the creatures. There's a visual creature. I don't mean like you can see it, right? I mean that there's the visual system is a system, a dynamical system that's running, and it has baked into it, it's, if we want to call them embeddings, baked into that is the process for running itself. And for like, now we see the generative models can actually generate like the visual world, sort of similar kind of process probably. And so coming back to your point, I think the reason red and orange look the way they do from a qualitative standpoint is because of the embedding space itself. The thing that allows us to do vision actually captures within it the same way in the language. It's the relations between words, because that's language. That's what it's made of, words and their relations. But vision is made of, in some ways, a mapping or something. It's not even the right word, of physical qualities, right, of the world. It's wavelengths and things like that. And these end up getting in our embedding as they're it's a dynamical system that's generative, but the proximity or something of we can't think of them as tokens, like red and orange aren't tokens the same way they are in the linguistic space. But the redness and the orangeness, the things they do within this dynamical system, the fact that they're actually close together is like it's a qualitative kind of property that's something to do with like the redness and orangeness. And so I tend to think that the qualitative aspect of it is sort of fundamentally an aspect of the neural structure, namely embedding. It's not recruited, right? In your view, and we may end up thinking very similar thoughts, but it was just a little surprising to me because it almost it's like kind of the inverse of it is where in your case it's sort of let's recruit. Visual processing seems like a good thing to use this sort of qualitative structure for, whereas I'm thinking no, it's the visual structure which necessitates this qualitative structure. It's like it's direct a sort of outcome of it. So now I said my piece.
Yeah, I can respond to it. I mean, I think the exciting thing is that there's, I think, a way of disambiguating between these two models with specific predictions. So one of the things, for example, that I hypothesize, I talked about this with Joe Shabach we have like an interview on YouTube
This was
about this.
the in-person salon you guys did, right?
Yes.
Perfect. I'll link that for people. Yeah.
But yeah, we're talking about is Qualia's, for example, is the state space of color like a reflection of kind of like our world embeddings, or is it something more fundamental and more basic? And I would argue that it's actually more fundamental and more basic. That like the state space of color is kind of like a Platonic thing in a sense. It's kind of like ultimately has to do with raw physics, and it's actually kind of like sensory agnostic. That like you can explore the state space of color using sounds. Like if you have the right kind of synesthesia, as long as you can experience all of the colors with some sound, what you can do is play specific sounds and modify them just enough so that you essentially produce two different phenomenal colors. And then you can label those two phenomenal colors as having a just noticeable difference between them. And my claim is that, even if you've been blind all your life, if you're able to experience color qualia through audio, and then you do this just noticeable difference mapping, and you start laying the colors in a space, it will turn out to be the case that space will be a 3D and Euclidean space. In particular, this space called the CLab space, which is, dark to black, black to white, red, green, and then blue, yellow. And any phenomenal color is like somewhere in this three-dimensional space. Now, it may be the case that you experience a lot of blue in your life. So, the distribution of like frequency of encountering these colors might be really lopsided. But my claim is that the actual shape of that space will always be 3D Euclidean, as long as you're using that qualia, because that's a property of the qualia. Yeah.
You got to read that paper because it's more in concert with your perspective than mine, Frank. I'm realizing now because it's sort of along the same lines. It's sort of this latent space where there's this common geometry, and it's sort of what you're saying is with that common geometry. That's the real thing. That's sort of, and that's where qualities live. And it doesn't matter what you're mapping to it, right? It doesn't matter if it's coming from audition or origin is like there. That no, it's the lower level, the higher level. I don't know which one, right? But it's sort of at a different substrate. Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. I have to think, but yeah, okay. At the same time, the fact is that different modalities do live in different sort of embedding space. And so I guess my question, it's a similar question to what I asked originally. So do you think qualities live in yes, I guess in a sort of what should we call it? Sort of I guess a different latent space from the individual modalities. Is that sort of
Yeah, and I suspect it's in some sense, kind of this like Platonic thing, and then
By the way, they use that exact word. Just so
okay,
it's literally the word Platonic.
I've got to read it. Yes.
So,
You
if there is this kind of Platonic geometry that's out there, that we could think of it as kind of an attractor, and that we've all kind of converged to this similar geometry in our minds, so that we can kind of agree this is red, this is up, this is down, and so on. If that is a universal, is that something that evolved for us to have that kind of developmental and that species level attractor? And if so, why would machines not fall into that same attractor and find that same universal geometry?
Yeah. Okay. Like maybe think about it this way. Like if you have a three balls connected via springs, right? Kind of a three-body problem in a sense, right? Like it will have like its possible vibrational modes, right? And the possible vibrational modes are going to be completely the consequence of like, okay, like what is the strength of the strings and how far they are from each other, and okay, like in how you make them vibrate in space. So that system, will have a state space. It's like, okay, could be vibrating this way, vibrating this way, vibrating this way. And that will have like kind of a specific geometry in terms of like just noticeable differences in terms of like the vibrational modes of that system. So what I'm saying is something along the lines of, let's say, like color qualia, or let's say like smells, is kind of the result of something like that. It is like, okay, there's like this state space of this dynamic system, and it has all of these like various modes, and it has a unique geometry. And then like that's kind of like a primitive. And then, yeah, there's like cells that do that. They're like specialized. They love, doing the 3-body problem with springs. And then, down the line, as you grow up, they get selected for representing, let's say, like visual information, because they're just like that. There is a very nice mapping between the configuration space of that system and, let's say, like different spectral power distribution that enters our eyes. But, it's kind of like specialized in that, like you could construct kind of like adversarial input such that, hey, actually, the best qualia to represent that range of input is not, let's say, color anymore. Maybe it's actually scent, in which case maybe you may have like an adaptive synesthesia, where like for some specific visual tasks, actually processing it as like scent would actually be better for you. You would just like make more effective and fast inferences. But we evolved in an environment where, like, yeah, the mapping was like pretty clear. But my sense is that, yeah, like constructing adversarial stimuli, you might be able to do that. The case of a digital computer, in some sense, is kind of like sampling in some sense, a larger range of possible kind of like primitives. So you don't have kind of these like natural, states of a dynamic system as kind of your reservoir, as your kind of like palette or how do you call it? Yeah, kind of like your range of building blocks. Mm-hmm. And so there's just like some things that will take like longer to train, or the inference will not be. I mean, the inference will be approximate, right? It's kind of like if you're simulating a 3-body system with a neural network, if you feed it enough data, eventually it can learn it. But oftentimes you can find like just kind of the right adversarial input where the neural network is not going to be simulating it very well because it just didn't see that case, for example. And my claim is that there will be like artifacts like that you can kind of find the right adversarial input such that, like, yeah, the primitives the neural network latched onto are going to be actually different than the ones that we are latching onto. And in particular, I think, yeah, like things involving holography is where we will see like very strong effects here, where like, hey, like why is our system so suspiciously efficient or suspiciously effective? And I think my guess is going to be, because it's using this piece that uses nonlinear optics as part of its processing.
I want to actually shift into, we do have a couple hands, but I want to shift things slightly in the olfaction.
Yes, exactly. We should make sure Eliade has time,
yes,
right?
Yes. So I did want to shift things into the olfaction kind of side of things, because one of the things I've been working on for a long time is this olfactory language. And sort of the premise of that was me just literally taking, my parents' colognes, perfumes when I was a kid, whatever, breaking the seal and then making like smell shapes on a piece of paper and then smell reading left to right. I know what this looks like. I'm not doing that. But smell reading, left to right and associating each like block of smell, each shape of smell with either another smell or like, some other thought or word or visual or whatever in my head. And I noticed if I kept doing this enough over time, it would start to stick almost like I was learning a language. And there was this kind of language or this kind of structure that would kind of come out of that. And one of the crazier ones that I'd even tried as well is I would try to do like math with smell. So I'd have like one smell associated with a number, another smell associated with a number, and I would try to calculate what the end calculation number would be by only interfacing with the smells. And one of the things Eliade and I have talked about is the experience of new smells entirely, and how certain smells can lead to altered states, right? Because one of the things with the olfactory language is that I feel that I had this whole write-up and presentation on that language can induce altered states. So, things like associating a certain interior, an internal symbol with some kind of a feeling or sensation. You build this up strong enough that it can start to stick. For me, something really big was like pain relief and migraines. So for many years now, I have really, really bad migraines, and I didn't want to rely on the medication anymore. And I thought about associating an internal like thought or symbol inside of my head with the feeling of the pain relief, right? And doing that over and over and over. And then eventually I can feel that pain relief just by thinking about it. I don't know if it's getting to the core of whatever's causing the migraine, but I can tell you subjectively, perceptually, I don't feel it. And so one of the things I want to ask Eliade is how different things, different kinds of smells can cause altered states even. So altered states would be the theme, and olfaction.
Mhm. So there is a sense in which the texture of experience is synchronizing, where we have something like linalool, which has a very chalky and playful texture that is very soft and receptive of all sorts of sharp edges and like intensities of pain. We can put these things in the same field as a linalool field. And as we focus on linalool, the intensity of these characteristics seems to couple with the intensity of the pain. So we can, over these distinct boundaries of experience, we can create a little bit of permeability and like textural blending so that pain starts to dissipate or become more empty. Within the field of pain, you can often see that it's taken on linalool texture. It has this new chalkiness, and its pain is being pushed to the margin of the space that it used to occupy very centrally. So I think there is a very powerful way that having skillful mental orientations to texture and colors in the field can create something, can create a very helpful agency in this field. It gives you a better way to navigate instead of being a passive recipient of these conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the textural quality and the synesthesia with sense to me is like most prominent with, for example, one of the one of the perfumes that we made for QRI, which is Fearless, which is essentially like a combination of scents that is like specifically designed to like try to cancel out fear vibrations. And like you may not notice just how much like fear is actually this kind of like crackly, kind of like unstable body image. Until you actually, well, okay, you may take something to reduce the anxiety, but like it's fascinating that something like scent can actually kind of like smooth over some of these like fear sensations. And yeah, I guess like if you're curious, like the core notes, core accord for that is
Banana.
banana, vanilla, jasmine, honeydew melon. All of those are kind of like really anti-fear as far as kind of like the very textural blending of the sense modalities go.
I want to actually address both of you, Andres and Eliade, on this kind of topic. Is I think a lot about like far transfer and near transfer. So when people talk about like cognition and the ability to learn some kind of skill and then whatever else it could transfer to indirectly without having explicitly trained on it, I think about like, why is it that you don't have to necessarily train on something to have an effect from it? All right, so there is, like we were telling you, there's certain scents or smells or whatever that can induce a pretty, intense effect. You haven't trained on that, but are you trained on something else or innately trained or whatever, such that it has these far transfer effects? And then the question then is if that's true, what else does that maybe apply to in the kind of sensory cognition space of things? I'm curious about like trainability and far transfer for stuff like this.
What comes to mind is, okay, how can we generalize this stimulus to mean something to many different textures? Can we apply linalool to dissonant harmonies? And so in my own experience of singing in a chorus, I've seen things like a synesthetic appearance of lavender as soon as we've hit those right keys. And as we have like hit into that dissonance, the feeling of bringing up lavender actually puts me back right into that space. It's much easier to move the muscular aperture back into some subconscious figure of rightness, of harmony, when there's some synchrony there. And it may be a total illusion of just pure synchrony in the field. I may not be sounding any better than I already was, but it gives that impression that you can transfer around the instantiation and relaxation of tension in the field across modalities.
Yeah. I'll add that, yeah, super very general skills that are like very upstream of like a lot of qualia exploration, or kind of like sensitizing yourself to low level patterns, is really Shinzen Young's kind of like 3 core skills in meditation, which is equanimity, concentration, and sensory clarity. Like, boosting your concentration will be generally useful across the board in terms of like analyzing like audio sensations, tactile sensations, smell sensations. Equanimity, so that you don't flinch, because like one of the key aspects that prevents kind of like a full-fledged sensory processing is flinching at stimuli, kind of like resisting it or adding a little bit of kind of a constriction around it. And like just the very general attitude of like, okay, like welcoming fully any sensation, whether it's positive or negative, that generalizes across the board. And then, yeah, like sensory clarity, which comes with a lot of meditations, particular things such as like noting tactile sensations or doing body scans, also generalizes, right? Like if you enter a perfume exploration with very high sensory clarity, you're going to be making many more precise associations that otherwise they would just get kind of lost in the muck, as it were. So yeah, very high level concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity, I think, are maybe some of the most translatable skills across the board.
So before we get to all the audience questions, because I think there's a ton of people that have their hands raised, and we should probably be good on time to not waste too much time. So one of the things that I wanted to think about, right? So this is actually a pretty big focus with ekkolápto, and it's this kind of thing about like, how do you enhance the capabilities of the mind and the body to better understand reality? Like philosophy technology almost. I think Vervaeke has like psychotechnology. This is like philosophy technology in a sense. And with other members of QRI, several which right? I've spoken a lot about cognitive enhancement, better ways of measuring cognitive ability, at least in humans, and the ways of potentially improving it. And one of the questions I'd have for both of you, Eliade and Andres, is what are the sort of ways you feel that what are your own kinds of cognitive augmentation meditation techniques that you've kind of pioneered and come up with on your own? QRI techniques in a sense for meditation.
Yeah. I mean, if you're curious, we definitely have like a series of guided meditations on YouTube. So if you look up like Qualia Research Institute guided meditations, we have like 20 or so, and they're kind of half meditation, but also just kind of half educational for like, hey, here's something you can try during meditation, or here's something else that really trains some of these like very upskill, high level transferable skills, like, okay, like varieties of attention, for example, or how to ratchet up the energy parameter in different regions of your experience. That's also very general. How to apply loving kindness, how to apply equanimity to different facets of the field. So yeah, all of that is like super general. In terms of kind of like more serious enhancement, I mean, like something that I would maybe point you to, it's the tracer replication tool, and in particular, a really cool thing that you can do with this, which I'll also we'll post in the in the chat. So this is a Vice article about some of the techniques that we developed. So this is more of a kind of like a cocktail party type of a fun thing to share, but it is pointing at something very real though. which is this idea that we came up with this thing we call psychedelic cryptography, which is that images and videos that you can only decode if you're on LSD or psilocybin. And it's actually a very simple concept, at least in these ones. They're taking advantage of the tracer effects. So like if you move your hand around on psychedelics, you get kind of this like lingering image in your visual field. So, 10 years ago, it occurred to me like, hey, maybe we can use this to like paint something, right? Like put fragments of an image one at a time so that you can only see the picture if you're like sufficiently high. We ran a competition for that, and there are winners, like the ones that are in the report are like, hey, this actually works. We actually tested it. It truly has secret messages. But I would kind of encourage more broadly like that, right? It's like, what are kind of like resonant frequencies or flickering patterns that in some states of consciousness can be decoded, but not in others. And I think there's probably a lot of rich, juice to be derived there if somebody does this kind of more
I'm
academically,
immediately
professionally.
thinking about the DMT laser thing. I know you talked about it on Kurt's podcast, at least for a little bit. I did want to have one comment on something as well for both of you. Last one, and then we'll go to I think a lot about like. So like I would like to really build Legos as a kid, and I still do. It's a little bit of an addiction. It's a very expensive addiction, but I've curbed the habit mostly for a little while, right? And I would think about when I was a kid and I'd try to build more of the complicated Lego sets. I was like, is there some way where I could train myself to kind of experience the visual information in front of me, the visual and spatial information in front of me, such that the bricks, wherever they're kind of laid out on the table, the structure of what it's supposed to turn into is very implicit, right? Now, here's the tricky thing. I could have, puzzle pieces, Lego, whatever, and it's like, oh, this could be a Millennium Falcon. And if I have the sort of concept of the Millennium Falcon, which is, for those who don't know, a very, popular ship in Star Wars, I can look at these pieces, whatever, and it's like, oh, like, that's obvious. There's enough constraints on the pieces, or at least the way that I'm perceiving that, such that I can be like, okay, these piece together and they make the Millennium Falcon. But that's only because I have the concept of the Millennium Falcon in the first place, right? And so how would those types of things be generated if you didn't have the pre-existing concept? And the bigger thought experiment that can tie into that, whoever wants to answer this can answer this as well, is, and I've talked about this at other salons, but I would think about like, the inception of fire. Like, okay, yeah, most likely we saw smoke or fire somewhere, whatever happening, and we kind of learned from that, right? But let's just say you didn't see fire and smoke anywhere at all. That just was not in the picture. That concept, anything like it, was not in your headspace at all. How would you have known that putting rocks and sticks together could have ever created something like that? And so for me, that's about like the unknown unknowns, the blind spots that we don't know we have. How do you... I guess it's also sort of asking about what is novelty or originality. I'm curious if you've examined this kind of question before, Andres or Eliade.
So what comes to mind first is that if you get a kit of the Millennium Falcon and it's totally blank, there's secondhand bots on it, you can still see that there are pieces of radar antenna, there are blasters, maybe there are tiny ships inside.
Right.
Work as like accessory pieces. And so, in part, you can be guided by your sense of symmetry and the need to use all of the pieces in order to approximate what is going to be the size of the ship, what is going to be realistic for whatever construction you make. You don't necessarily have the specific concept of the Millennium Falcon. You may not even have a concept of a spaceship, but you might come up with a ship for the ocean that has many of the same features like an aircraft carrier.
And actually, it would be interesting to say about, you could say, what type of problem is the Millennium Falcon spaceship trying to solve? And maybe you're not going to make the exact same Millennium Falcon, but you might make something similar enough to get to the same means by a same goal by different means, right? And in a lot of ways, I think this ties into, so Andres was just talking about psychedelic cryptography. On ekkolápto, we talk about perceptual cryptography in general, about like optical illusions, because even the logo of ekkolápto is the Necker cube optical illusion. Or there's the brainstorm green needle audio illusion. Like that's literally as far as I know, physically the same audio, and now all of a sudden 2 different minds can hear it completely differently, right? What cryptography is in a lot of ways is you're trying to have one observer look at information one way and then the other observer look at it in another way. All right, so I could send out, I know William Hahn has talked about this before, where we could send out signals to space, whatever, and to the right observer, it's going to sound like a signal, but to everybody else, it might be noise and meaningless. And so that just gets me thinking about the way information is trapped up in whatever this platonic object, whatever it is, and how do we access and put the key in the lock to unlock it and get access to that. I'm curious, Andres, if you want to finish up, and then we'll get to questions after. What do you think about stuff like that?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think it's clearly the case that in the case of like smaller organisms, there is kind of like adversarial dynamics when it comes to, like, for example, like vision, where like a lot of insects pretend to be, for example, like another insect, or they may pretend to be like, there's even like some caterpillars that effectively pretend to be snakes, and like, okay, like they might be able to fool, like another insect, maybe like a small animal, but they're not able to fool us. Of course, we don't know if there are creatures around us that are able to fool us. Maybe that is one of the unsettling implications here. But I actually tend to get the sense that like we are in some sense on a computationally more general space, where like the human visual system is kind of like, it's not fully general, but it's like much more general than, let's say, like an insect visual system. And we might be like tapping into like some much more kind of like general principles of visual computation that are like a lot harder to fool. That is not to say, though, that like you can't find like adversarial examples. And there was like this post by Joshua Bach that I thought was hilarious, where like because you can fool a convolutional neural network in this very. It's like, hey, this looks like a picture of a dog. It's like almost exactly a dog, but there's like a few squiggly lines, and the neural network says very confidently, like, oh, this is a cat, or like this is a lizard, or something like that. Joshua Bach actually flips it around and says like, oh, here's a lizard appearing like a dog, like as an adversarial input to the human brain, just kind of like assuming, okay, actually the convolutional neural network is actually able to see better, and we are the ones that have like the improper inferences that are just, they're just like for like the common everyday use. But yeah, I mean, it goes both ways, right? Like in some sense, clearly there's a lot of like possible adversarial inputs that we just would not be able to experience. But on the whole, I think like we're much more general, kind of like we approximate a fully general visual system, but not quite.
Perfect. So now let's open it up to a lot of people who had their hands raised for a while. I think Praj wants to go first.
Yeah, sure. So I have a question that's maybe a little more out there, if that's okay. It's related to Andres and QRI's work more broadly. Can everyone hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool. Yeah, so I really like QRI's approach of starting with exotic states of consciousness to understand how consciousness fundamentally works, because I think that a lot of neuroscience kind of starts with taking the default state of the brain as sort of vanilla consciousness, and then the introduction of stress or drugs or psychosis or whatever sort of an aberration of that state, which is missing the big picture that Andres presented today, which is that our brain's default processing mode is not how consciousness inherently works, and it takes a lot of processing to generate a sort of consistent world simulation. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask about an exotic state of consciousness that I've never heard you or anyone else in QRI discuss, which is near-death experiences. So these are experiences that happen like technically after death, but before a person is resuscitated. But they have a lot of really interesting phenomenal qualities. So like a lot of people that report having them say that like they're incredibly hyper real. Like they almost have the same relationship to our everyday experience as our everyday experience has to a dream, which is that like people are convinced that like what they see in these experiences are like true reality, and that actually even now we're living in the dream. And it seems that unlike things like DMT or 5-MeO DMT, which are either very noisy or very low information, they seem in contrast like extremely high information, and they're saying have all the senses and all the information presented very clearly. And I think even if these experiences aren't veridical, like they're not actually pointing to something like an afterlife, it is still an interesting question of why do they have all these qualities in a situation where the brain is underneath so much physiological stress. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. One limiting factor is I don't have like a lot of close friends who have had profound like near-death experiences to compare like with other states of consciousness. But as far as I know, literature-wise, I mean, it is true that like a lot of near-death experiences are hyper-realistic, but so is the case with DMT experiences. And kind of like my impression, and also like talking to one of the key like near-death experience researchers, Pascal, forget his surname, but he works at Imperial College. But yeah, he was analyzing the commonalities between DMT and 5-MeO and near-death experiences, and there's like a lot of overlap. On the side of DMT, kind of this like hyper-real, high-definition version of consciousness, and then on the side of 5-MeO DMT, the ego dissolving and kind of the realizing what I might call kind of like the anonymous perspective on consciousness, which is like not experiencing your consciousness as if it was yours, but actually kind of more this impersonal entity that is maybe something that feels like it encompasses multiple lifetimes. But yeah, no, I mean, I would be very curious to like dig deeper into near-death experience, and like in particular what computational benefits that state of consciousness may afford, because whether or not like the remote viewing kind of like aspect of it, that some people report, hey, I was able to see the doctors operating on me and stuff like that. My default assumption is that that's hallucination happening. But like independently of the status there, clearly there's some kind of like information processing that is happening. But and I would be curious to kind of like quantify, hey, like what is the information bandwidth, for example, the visual field during a near-death experience? And it would seem to me that it's probably very high, like maybe similar to like on DMT. So definitely very, very significant for research.
It reminds me of your kind of camera argument from earlier, that we're not really looking out the lens anyway.
Yeah.
And so when these people kind of report, oh, I could look down at myself. Well, you're not looking out either. You've built this, theater, and you have this, most of it is going to be unconscious processing. You don't really know how or why you've decided the geometry of the orientation and shape and layout of stuff around you. And I don't think there's very strong reason why you couldn't perceive it from a different angle if there was kind of evolutionary pressure to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like, like the particular rendering of your scene is taking all of these unconscious information and just projecting it from a super specific standpoint. But yeah, if that frame breaks, the information is still there. It can be rendered in all sorts of other ways, which might explain like seeing yourself from above or from behind.
That used to be an exercise I would do when I was like a kid on the bus coming from school. I would look out the window and I'd try to like look at the the trees going by or whatever, and say like, okay, what if I saw this but from like 4 feet like outside of the thing, like if I was on a camera with a boom, seeing that. And so I would, from my perspective, I would look at the trees and I would try to get a 3-dimensional vision for how they're oriented, and try to recreate that vision in my mind's eye, from a different perspective. It's always a lot of fun. On the subject of hallucinations, I have, so if you're seeing something in motion with your eye, then that's being perceived like you're seeing this color qualia and like an added motion vector of like it's going this way. And so by the time you synthesize that in your visual perception, like you're getting this, what you're seeing along with the motion thing. If you're seeing something static and then so nothing's moving, but you have like a hallucinogen going into your brain, and if it activates those neurons which are responsible for signaling motion, then you see something static, you're having artificially induced neuronal activation for motion, and then in the perception, would it be like you're hallucinating, like things wobbling around?
Yeah. No, that's a great point, and I think the answer is yes to a first approximation. So one thing to point you at is this article on Qualia on QRI that's called the pseudo time arrow, which is trying to explain the feeling of the passage of time. And it seems, I mean, as far as I can tell, time is constructed by essentially like overlaying several kind of like snapshots, almost kind of like the frame rate of experience, as it were. It's essentially like there you go in the link, perfect. The tracer effects on psychedelics is kind of like one way of thinking about the internal passage of time, because usually sensations disappear very quickly. And so like the thickness of our experience along that arrow of time is like very thin. Whereas on psychedelics, sometimes like sensations last for a very long time. So you get this like feeling of kind of like, oh, I'm kind of like spread out over time. I mean, like this very strange sensation of like you're talking to somebody in a room, you go to a different room, but part of you is still in the other room. And like you have kind of this like sense of the continuation of the past. And in extreme cases, very high dose like LSD, for example, the feeling of time can actually like wrap around, and you may get stuck in like what some people describe as a time loop, where like your sense of what just happened becomes kind of like tied to what's about to happen, and the the whole cycle essentially reinforces. And then the most extreme kind of like phenomenal time, as we call it, is moments of eternity, where essentially every frame looks exactly the same, and so there's just no sense of like displacement or change, and like that just feels like you're like in a timeless kind of universe, and it can be very unsettling, especially if it's the first time that you experience it. Once you've experienced it a bunch of times, it's like, oh yeah, okay, the timeless state is happening again. We've all seen it. but yeah, meaning to say that, yeah, like the feeling of movement and the passage of time, as far as I can tell, is absolutely a construction. It's like this part of the fabrication of the experience, and it's not that we have like direct access to time. Like it's just part of the simulation as well.
I have a question for Andrés. So I am very intrigued about the framework of the textures in terms of the tactile and visual field, and how you describe in DMT experiences, right? How there can be instances where you have an agreement and then you are able to resolve some sort of tactile tension, right? And that's very interesting, though, where DMT produces these competing clusters of coherence. It got me thinking about hallucinogens where the attractor is towards like all the way towards those symmetries, or an agreement. So something like MDMA, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on what might be happening there, especially with nystagmus involved, right?
Yeah. So this is in the case of MDMA that you get the feeling of your whole experience kind of like vibrating in a pleasant, creamy, smooth way. I'd estimate maybe between like 8 and 12 hertz. It's not a super high frequency vibration, but there's like clearly, faster than your breath, but like, slower than a DMT hallucination. We think that kind of like what that is doing is adding kind of like a Gaussian blur to experience. I mean, it's like you're stacking sensations, but like displacing them slowly and slightly, and you're kind of like smoothing out the edges. And so there's a sense in which like the discomfort of discontinuities and the kind of cracks between textures on MDMA, they get softened away. I mean, it's almost kind of like you're just applying a low pass filter. You're really getting rid of all the kind of like high frequencies and just letting kind of the big blur to come through. And indeed, like if you're in a very nice kind of like MDMA state to begin with, and then you take DMT, the way the textures will self-organize will be radically different, because now they kind of like grow on this medium that is already in a pre-agreement, right? So like the shapes will be like much more loving, and also literally the texture is going to be much like more smooth, right? Like DMT, while on MDMA, will be kind of like a lot of silk and a lot of satin and just like these very nice textures, as opposed to something like cotton or peeling of the clothing. I think that's what it's called. Like the clothes are not peeled when we're putting it. And 5-MeO DMT is the other super extreme example where like the main attractor is kind of global coherence, and that also like smooths out everything. I mean, in the process of smoothing everything out, you may encounter these very uncomfortable cracks, but if the smoothing out is successful, then effectively any hallucination that is built on top of it will be like really soft. One last maybe kind of like object level aspect of what I think might be going on here might be kind of with MDMA, with euphoric states of consciousness like that, you're kind of like creating a very pleasant consonant bass. It's kind of, there's like this very bass, very robust vibration that then anything that you add on top of it is kind of like built on this very solid foundation. And so, yeah, you may add like kind of trippy visuals with DMT, but they're already built on top of this very solid harmonic structure. Whereas pure DMT on a normal state is just kind of like you're adding all of these very high frequencies, but they don't have a base to self-organize around. And therefore you end up with these kind of different kingdoms or different domains of like different clusters of frequencies that are competing with each other, but they don't have a base to agree on to self-organize. And I think that framework in general is going to be very helpful to make sense of this. And it also gives us actionable information because you can preload your state, with body vibration, with breath work, to the point where you feel this very nice base. And then if you do a DMT trip, it's going to be, generally speaking, much more pleasant, much more, friendly, because the parts are like pre-harmonized.
Perfect. Cool. All right.
Thank you.
I got one last thing for all of you. In true ekkolápto fashion, we always like to save something really cool at the end to talk about. There's something that a couple of you here on the call, we've spoken about this before, about doing some kind of olfactory hackathon together. I know QRI is extremely fascinated by olfaction, as am I. There's a couple people, Shresh, Yo-Yo, Lucy, they're in SF that are working on some really cool stuff. And so is Eliade. And as a special little presentation for the end to leave you guys kind of thinking about things, we want to give a little spotlight here on what Eliade is working on for QRI on the phenomenal objects of odor, because this is going to directly lead into a potentially, hopefully very large olfactory hackathon that we'll either do maybe in Boston later this year, maybe in Cambridge. So if you know anybody who's interested in coming through that, I know many people have been asking me about this. So anyways, Eliade, take it away.
Hey, thank you, Addy. And I really want to thank Yvonne for all of the artwork that he rushed to finish for this presentation. He's just amazing at this. I had no slides before he started. So what I want to talk about today is how odor experiences can be modeled geometrically and with coupling and experience. A lot of these, the orientation in olfaction is not clear from the start. And in the West, our ability to point to what is going on in odor space, or even the spatial aspect of odor, is very low resolution. We have very few words that can single out more discrete spaces. And so I want to just touch on how we can orient to what's going on in these spaces and navigate through any particular instance of olfaction in order to find the full complement of, the chemical's ability to show you things. There is a material semantic level in which we are orienting to the odor qualia landscape by definitions of things that have a good index to these chemicals, to these parts of qualia space. For example, of the difficulty, the close molecular neighborhood of vanilla seen right here is clove. And down here we have guaiac wood and charcoal and not pictured anise. And down here we have cresols. Up here is mimosa space. We have raspberry space, very sour and piquant types of mimosa, almost like malic acid. In describing this, only cresol is a molecular landmark. All of these others are material objects with a high index to the odor. And many chemicals in this neighborhood of vanilla partially overlap in their presentation of qualia. Even the characteristic ones we would think of for an object individually don't have those monolithic colors that would make a singular classification really viable. Vanillin, it's full of clove, oigonol, it's the main aromatic component of clove, but it still has, neighborhoods in guaiac, in vanilla, in mimosa. Really, the cresilic field is the most isolated out of all of these. And so we can point to their molecular structure. But for the most part, we have this very oddly continuous qualia space that is not partitioned by each of these chemicals. So this makes distances in qualia space somewhat difficult to measure. The chemicals are distinct, but unlike a well-ordered set of numbers, the chemicals don't partition the space. We can't use those same tools to pattern out what this set of distances should. Some factor analyses have already been done for these material level labels, but we still don't have particularly precise or consistent property data for things like the sparkle and crack of eugenol, the smoothness of vanilla, the way it synchronizes in the field and creates blends that are, unable to be formed between two competing clusters. A similar problem is the discretion of the functional groups of the chemical input. It is very much unclear how one should organize variation in molecular geometry in order to predict a continuous walk through qualia space. If scent were analogous to color, then you could change rose into skunk with just one input value. But as we see here, the walk between phenylethyl alcohol, phenylethane thiol, and phenylethyl mercaptan, first it requires sulfur to substitute oxygen, and then we have to shift sulfur's carbon bond. Neither of these operations has a really well-defined outcome across molecules, and it's also not clear how these operations could be comparable. One of the future directions of QRI and its interest in olfaction is with Luca Turin's electromagnetic geometry of these molecules, searching for some potentially more continuous map. With this said, I think a poor orientation to odors is largely related to how poor their interactability is. You can't go into odor space and latch onto it with your phenomenal proprioception and twist it around, look at it from different angles in a really easy way. The manipulability is just very heavily lacking. And we'll touch on later some of these more directly manipulation-like techniques. But it appears that affordances to explore different categories by a more passive investigation are exclusively related to the shared properties between categories or the volatility in the chemical receptor interaction. So we could think of shared properties that allow the transition to new stability as edges between the nodes of a graph. Thinking of this as a graph, one of the common results is that a set of edges you can explore changes across stabilities. Exiting from a banana field and into magnolia of, say, benzyl acetate, you may obscure mushiness and wax in favor of things like smoothness and grease. And mapping out this graph structure might then show how closely two qualia are related based on the length and number of these walks. The property nodes may be shared, but if something is embedded in a stability, then perhaps without adding a significant amount of the energy of focus to it, the property may not be disposed to exit that profile it's stabilized in. Through your walk, you can get stuck somewhere unless you start adding a little bit of active investigation and moving more actively between these field configurations. It's often adding energy to something. This can be a shared property, a tension in the field, a semantic item in a mental list. As long as your focal selection is precise enough and does not encompass the properties you wish to disconnect from, you might encounter a critical point where the selection has become so abstract and dynamic unto itself that releasing focus can place it into a new stability. So that is something like, if you focus on clove, its regular profile under vanilla may be very smooth, may be only partially asymmetric in that space. But if you can latch on to that faint crackling and add focal energy, and you can often see how that pattern becomes much more potent in the olfactory field. You get a quite wide patternicity. And suddenly, as it reaches a critical point of dissociating from that smoothness, its activity has its own vectors that want to stabilize somewhere else. And so simply letting go without even searching for a new stability. You might land somewhere else. In general, investigation is something like adding energy until your intervention makes something happen. But because scent is one of the most malleable senses to top-down influences, we are really heavily focused on blind trials and minimal effort to best map out what's going on in this chemical structure to qualia mapping. As another example, we have benzoene resinoid, which to me starts from a very confused benzyl alcohol and benzyl acetate character. Very noisy and citrusy, but attention on the naphtha note can bleach out some of that noise, revealing a pale bubble gum that's somewhat coupled with the benzyl alcohol character, very heavily ozonic.
So it's sort of masking it almost?
Yeah. In one of these analyses, bubblegum could then harmonize with the entire field. And as umami began to bloom, the texture complexified into this chewy candy rose. So across the entire field, you are feeling this depth of tactile sensation that is purely emergent from the bubblegum. This rose, however, fully competes with the benzyl acetate likeness. So even though the path you took through a partial coupler of benzyl alcohol got you close to rose, the rose itself is still a competitor of benzyl acetate. It's a very mysterious way that you can change the dimensions of affordance as you move throughout olfactory space. And this is very much the same thing. Increasing this intensity, a very symmetric landscape can be broken so that all of these dynamics must accommodate to the inability to have that prior symmetry. Of course, we are moving from horizontally symmetric lines to radial symmetry. This can often occur because of the very thing at the center, which is something bright and radiant. Even though its intensity drops off as so, the texture of it is not unlike what you would intuit as a diffusion of light into the periphery. And so you might have a secondary adaptation to, the less intense notes. Within the experience of scent, the geometry that is most accessible to describe as a class I call objects, a set of properties enclosed by a phenomenal boundary that can be informally considered the same thing. There are ideal cases, often the product of steep intensity drops, where edges are very distinct. But, to dogs, we might be having a very clear case of myopia. The blurriness of these object boundaries usually might experience nowhere near the crispness of vision. So objects are a class of spatial coupling, where the elements have become covariant enough to display some insensitivity to permeation across the boundaries. In another kind of spatial coupling, there is an ambiguous constraint on many odors, where some subset is heavily resistant to the extension of color beyond a small central region, which we have displayed here. This restriction on outward permeability does not imply a distinct edge, only that the colors passing over it become obscured. And this is a very concrete thing that you might experience, where a texture that exists in close coupling with a color, as soon as it passes over this boundary, continues to pattern out, but has no grounding in that color. You can tell they're the same thing, but you cannot rightly say that you are experiencing that odor qualia outside of that small field. Then we can also speak of negative coupling, where an edge is created by spatial competition, like rose and benzyl acetate. But in this case, there's not necessarily an encompassing bound for each competitor. These things might partition the space indefinitely off in the lateral directions. With weaker spatial coupling, we can see one or more features regularly break from an object. For example, intensity curves, blends, or gradients that form oddly relative to other field properties that they've been bound to. So you might have concentric ideas of mint and banana that end their intensity curves at the same place, but are very much a different amplitude and steepness. But as these two start to decouple, benzyl acetate might increase its curve outward so that you have a worse coupling of these object bounds. You are no longer seeing something that's invariant under some minor transformations. It wants to be banana and mint specifically. And so across analysis, phenomena very much do tend to outlast being bound to an object. We're really interested in this construct mainly so we can make simpler predictions about behavior, about how tension is emerging in the field and creating things that we can orient to. Most often the case is that we don't have a good monotonic coupling throughout the experience. And especially common is that active investigation, as it tries to indicate a property while sitting in that space and trying to observe passively, even having focus land on a property, may inadvertently concretize it as sufficiently homogeneous on its own to become its own object. So like tiny lime sparkles in an ozonic fog, you can orient to what lime is doing and try to investigate the frequency of its flickering on and off. But you might find that as soon as you do, it's no longer embedded in the fog, but it stands out spatially from that and is now partially competing. You are no longer allowed to see its diffuse crackles moving through the fog, but now it is a much thinner, smoother fog and a separated energetic lime. And this ties into sort of objectification beyond spatial continuity, where we have a coupling by similarity instead of by space, where a sufficient difference from other properties and colors appears to be another basis for intuiting the same thing, even distributed across. So this can be a texture. This can be a color like lime that dithers into these ozonic clouds. But lime may become intensity coupled. These points of texture show up and begin flickering together rather than as noise in the fog. And you get an experience like a reduction of the need to focus or the need to predict what the rest of these are doing. Their regularity is so close that you can just treat them as the same thing. So this collection, it can even be seen to move as a unit, existing and transforming around space without any internal relative motion.
What's the I'm curious as to what your core idea with this whole thing is, Eliade. As we're kind of gradually wrapping up, I would like to sort of center on what are your kind of biggest ideas to leave people with on this presentation.
So what I'm after is a sort of geometry of affordances in my graph structures. And the rest of the presentation, which is still about half of the content, is talking about the implementation of qualities in space and how we are constructing them with tension. What does it mean that we are experiencing a representation of something that has semantic meaning? Because olfaction is so random in the landing of chemicals in the nose, the receptor field is such a dimensional reduction of, how do you say, the close community of chemicals you might find in a physical substrate. It doesn't give you any real geometry of the object itself. It doesn't give you any high resolution indication of where it came from. Stereo olfaction is pretty heavily reduced in people. I'm interested in the top-down effects and how you can view it as being implemented in a sort of deterritorialized way. How the receptive field is not the only place where the construction of olfaction occurs. That very often you have odors here in front of the nose. You can, quote unquote, perceive them throughout this space. You can pattern out their textures to the entire world simulation. This is part and parcel to what I want to do with skillful mental attitudes and how patterning these textures outward can allow more agency. Tension is a huge part of odor geometry, where, as on this slide, we see that taking one point of view, you can find a very symmetric and smooth orientation, but from another, it is very messy and chaotic. There is something about the way you're holding yourself as a subject toward an object that often creates the very geometry of the experience that you are trying to note in a report. So something like celery seed that I've experienced can very readily show the textures of smoothness, laminar flow, and resistance to moving through the space from one angle, whereas from another, you can see it very transparently, but it's very noisy and crackly. And so you might think of that literally as a set of two dimensions where you have a celery seed stalk and you have one along the grain and one against the grain. But this is a little bit too specific, too much of a metaphor.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think this could be an interesting area to potentially open up for some questions because it is getting late into the day.
Okay.
But I really wanted to thank you. Really incredible presentation, because I think the nice thing about these salons is that we tend to have an extreme variety and diversity of information. We had Dr. William Hahn, we had Dr. Ilan Barinholtz, we had Andres, we had you, Dugan hopped in, a couple other people hopped in, and we got a really, that's what I'm promoting for, sort of diversity of thought, perception, different kinds of minds coming together. And I wanted to see if anybody else had some questions for you as we wrap up. So I think Ilan has one he's been waiting for a very long time. Go ahead, Ilan.
Yeah, and it's the same question throughout. First of all, I'll phrase it this way. You make me feel like an olfactory idiot the way you talk about olfaction. And I'm wondering to what extent you actually maybe have, frankly, a genius for this, because you're able to almost take me into the spaces you're talking about, but I don't quite know what you're referring to. And I'm wondering to what extent do you think it's actually, and this gets into an operational question, a methodological question. You've clearly spent an enormous amount of time and effort sort of exploring these spaces. Do you think that you have a natural proclivity almost, or is this something that everybody else could come to the same terminology, understand what you're talking about, and then I guess methodologically, and then maybe a little more substantively, methodologically, is there a way of sort of, I don't want to be that guy, but, objective measurements, do you see that along some axis, that you've defined, there's like just noticeable differences that are meaningful, and that you could sort of define increments in that space, or is this primarily, a subjective walk that, while it's so obvious to me, the internal coherence from the way you're describing it, that it's real. I'm not in any way casting aspersion on that, but is there sort of a measurable, across individuals, for example, kind of analog to the kind of talk you're talking?
To start on my own proclivities, I would say that starting out, and I wish I had kept the notes I originally wrote instead of building upon them in a rather obscure way, because my sensitivity for smell has changed so dramatically over time that in the first place, I might write one or two lines for cyclaminaldehyde, which is now one of my favorite chemicals. And now I have probably several pages of exploring all sorts of categories in the space, what it's doing texturally, what its frequencies are showing me, how each of these qualities blends or indicates the others. And I really think that it's simply an orientation in the space, figuring out what it means to label things, to be able to concretize and specify something stable in the field, so that even if your report ends up being somewhat inaccurate to the blending, to the radiance and the full texture, at least you have some basis for going back and exploring later. And so I think just iterating upon finding stabilities and things I can describe, it made phenomenology much easier. And having a very large collection also does so, because it's very difficult to orient when you have a very monotonic space that you're floating around in. Can you express specifically what is different or dissociable about the space? It's very much unclear. And as you come to have a better profile of how these chemicals allow you to walk along qualia space, you're able to reinterpret what you are seeing in very, very marvelous constructions. It took me ages and ages, and my friend Yvonne's noting of it, to recognize mimosa in acetyl isoorganol, which is this very close vanilla space. He was the one who constructed for me this entire chemical qualia mapping of the neighborhood of vanilla. And it's an amazing
So you've definitely developed
thing that you'd never expect.
You developed sort of a I don't know what even to call it, but a sensitivity, a way of well, you now have a brain mapping that's much richer than the rest of us do for olfaction. Is there some trick you can do, sort of objective trick that you can do better now? To note it, to be able to memorize a smell, and later notice it and be able to identify it, or like I said, just noticeable difference between two smells that I find identical, but that you would be able to distinguish. Does it have any mapping outside of sort of the quality space to behavioral, measurable space?
So really, because we have a trouble of these inputs, that there's no really comparable way to modify input space. It seems like we have to walk around phenomenology and create subjective reports of a qualitative continuity, and then iterate that out across many people so that we have a range of error in how closely people can find these blends.
Yeah, maybe kind of like something like
Go for it.
testable, kind of like in what way, like, okay, like a framework, like what Elliot is describing, kind of like generalize, and that is like, okay, like if we identify things in the qualia space, irrespective of, okay, like how the receptors affinity map onto it, just like looking at the patterns within qualia space, the sort of thing that comes up are things such as like, hey, like predicting that, let's say, a category of scents like musks, for example, which smell very smooth and tend to blend to things. You can predict in advance, like, hey, this is going to cause like an olfactory illusion when I combine it with this molecule, because it's going to get rid of the dissonant high frequencies, right? So like you can arrive at kind of like a model of how scents combine that doesn't live in the chemical space, but lives in kind of these like intermediate kind of like building blocks of qualia space. And the predictions would essentially look along the lines of, hey, even though we have never combined these two molecules, we can predict that if you show them together to a random person, they would, for example, confuse this lemon note for a grapefruit note, for example, because you're kind of like patching it over in such a way that you're adding, the right kind of like grapefruit low frequency noise. In other words, like the proof being in the pudding in this context, I think would be in the shape of like being able to predict olfactory illusions. And I don't think we're there, but I think it's the sort of thing that would, show how these like cashes out into like precise, replicable objective measurements in a sense.
I just want to be clear. I'm not being I'm not positivist about any of this. That it's just that wouldn't that be that might be very rich actually, if you could be able to see how it maps to things like just noticeable differences, or like you said, certain kinds of illusions where you cross the boundary or don't cross the boundary, things like that.
Yes, agreed.
Awesome. I think with respect to time, we should probably start to wrap things up like an origami. Let's wrap things up a little bit. I am extremely appreciative for everybody who joined today. I know there are a chunk of you that could probably go on longer, and I would do this literally all day long and then some, but I also have a couple other things that are a little important not to get to today, but very, very appreciative for everybody who joined on. And I want to quickly highlight our panelists who are here on the chat right now. Professor Barinholtz, where can people find you and your very interesting work in the near future?
I got a Substack. That's my name. It's also called the Generative Brain. I don't know how Substack works exactly, so it's both.
Right.
But you can find me there. That's primarily where I'm getting my ideas out right now, because they're hot and fresh and are peer reviewed yet and published. But that's the stuff I'm thinking about all day long. So if people want to jump in on that conversation, I would very much appreciate it.
And I believe people may also be seeing you somewhere also on a pretty large platform in the future.
We hopefully.
Okay, in the works.
I don't know how long the editing takes, but yes.
In the works. In the works. All right, Eliade, where can people find you?
I'm also on Substack, eliade.substack. If you want to message me, I'm on Twitter. I can respond very asynchronously, but I have all of my perfume notes on my Substack. If you want to look at any particular chemical and what I've said about it, it is a crushing amount of detail.
Perfect. And in my case, you can find me. I'm ekkolápto, this guy right here. You can find me at ekkolápto.org. It's the same name on Twitter /X, Instagram, YouTube. You type that in, you'll probably find all of it. Ekkolápto is going to be in Boston, Cambridge, right? Waterloo and Toronto, and potentially McGill University in the next couple of weeks. Lots of very cool stuff cooking there. I can't wait to share it all for you. We may even have some returning guests there. Potentially, we might do something at the Perimeter Institute, the Fields Institute, some really cool stuff in the works there. And then last but not least, our lead speaker, Andrés. Where can people find you, even though this might be going on your channel? Where can people keep up with you?
Yeah, QRI.org, QualiaComputing.com, and my YouTube channel. Just look up Andrés Gómez Emilsson on YouTube. I try to put videos often there. The next video I'll be putting out is how to deal with DMT demons and bad entities. So be on the lookout for that.
Perfect. If you can leave everyone here with one last, question, thought experiment, what would it be?
Pay attention to the holographic qualities of your experience. And if you notice anything very holographic, definitely write it out and send me a note about it.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining this online polymath salon here with all these wonderful QRI people, machine perception, cognitive robotics professors, William Hahn and Ilan Barinholtz. This was a lot of fun. And we'll see you all for the next one. Take care.
Thanks, Eddie. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you.